November 22nd, 1963, 12:30 p.m. Central Time, Dealey Plaza, Dallas, Texas. Major General Chester Clifton walked 3 paces behind President Kennedy's limousine, carrying a black leather briefcase handcuffed to his left wrist. The briefcase weighed 45 pounds. Inside it was the power to end human civilization. Clifton was Kennedy's senior military aide, responsible for maintaining continuous communication between the President and the Pentagon. The briefcase he carried contained authentication codes that would verify Kennedy's identity when ordering nuclear launch, radio communication equipment to reach Strategic Air Command, and the Single Integrated Operational Plan, the PSYOP, listing every nuclear target and attack option available to American forces. The briefcase had a name, though few people knew it. Officially, it was called the President's Emergency Satchel. The military called it the Football because the nuclear war plan it contained was once codenamed Dropkick. The name stuck even after the codename changed. Clifton had carried the football for Kennedy since January 1961. He'd carried it to Vienna for the summit with Khrushchev. He'd carried it to the Pentagon during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He'd carried it to Hyannisport on vacation weekends. Wherever the president went, the football went. Wherever the football went, Clifton went. On this November day in Dallas, Clifton rode in a convertible following Kennedy's limousine through downtown streets lined with cheering crowds. The motorcade moved slowly. The sun was bright. Everything seemed routine. At 12:30 p.m., 3 shots cracked across Dealey Plaza. Kennedy's limousine suddenly accelerated. Secret Service agents leaped onto the presidential car. The motorcade broke formation, vehicles scattering in different directions. In the chaos and confusion, Clifton's follow car was separated from the presidential limousine. Kennedy's driver, Special Agent William Greer, received only one instruction over the radio: get to the hospital. He didn't wait for the follow cars. He didn't maintain motorcade formation. He drove as fast as the vehicle would move toward Parkland Memorial Hospital, 3 miles away. Clifton, in the separated follow car, shouted for his driver to pursue the presidential limousine. But traffic had already clogged the streets. Police motorcycles blocked intersections. Other motorcade vehicles were stopped or moving in different directions. The follow car couldn't reach the speeding presidential limousine. For 4 minutes, as Kennedy's car raced to Parkland Hospital with the dying president slumped in the back seat, the nuclear football was separated from presidential authority. Major General Chester Clifton, carrying the codes to launch America's nuclear arsenal, was stuck in traffic 3 blocks behind, unable to reach the president he was sworn to protect. If Soviet nuclear attack had occurred during those 4 minutes, if NORAD had detected incoming missiles, if Strategic Air Command had needed presidential authorization for retaliation, there would have been no way to reach Kennedy. No way to authenticate launch orders, no way to execute America's nuclear war plan. The president was dying. The codes were in traffic. And the system for controlling nuclear weapons had just revealed a vulnerability that no one had fully considered. What happens when the president and the football are suddenly, violently separated? Clifton's car finally reached Parkland Hospital at 12:38 p.m., 8 minutes after the shooting. He ran through the emergency entrance, still handcuffed to the briefcase, searching for Kennedy. Secret Service agents directed him to Trauma Room 1, where doctors were desperately trying to save the president's life. Clifton stood in the hallway outside the trauma room, the football handcuffed to his wrist, waiting. There was nothing else he could do. If nuclear war started in the next few minutes, the president was in no condition to make decisions. The vice president was somewhere else in the hospital, his location unknown to Clifton. The chain of command had fractured. At 1 p.m. Central Time, President John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. The doctors emerged from Trauma Room 1 and informed Clifton that the president was gone. Clifton looked down at the briefcase still handcuffed to his wrist. It contained the launch codes for a dead president. Vice President Lyndon Johnson was now president. He needed the football immediately. But Johnson was in a different part of the hospital, surrounded by Secret Service agents who were moving him to Air Force One for security. Clifton had to find him, transfer the football's contents to Johnson's authority, and re-establish nuclear command continuity. But first, he had a more immediate problem. The handcuff key was in his pocket. His hands were shaking so badly from adrenaline and shock that he couldn't get the key into the lock. It took him 3 attempts to unlock the cuff and free his wrist from the briefcase that suddenly felt heavier than it had that morning. Chester Clifton would later describe those minutes as the moment he truly understood what he carried. It wasn't just a briefcase full of codes and communication equipment. It was the weight of civilization itself, handcuffed to his wrist, dependent on his ability to stay close to presidential authority under any circumstances. In Dallas, on November 22, 1963, that system had failed for 4 minutes. And those 4 minutes revealed just how fragile nuclear command and control could be when violence and chaos intervened. The Dallas assassination exposed the first major vulnerability in America's nuclear command system: physical separation between the president and the football during crisis. The solution seemed obvious: keep the military aide closer to the president. But Dallas had shown that no matter how close the aides stood, sudden violence could separate them. Motorcades could scatter, crowds could intervene, chaos could prevent the aide from reaching the president when seconds mattered. Over the following months, the Secret Service and military planners redesigned presidential protection protocols to ensure the military aide carrying the football was never more than a few steps from the president. They were given priority access to motorcade vehicles directly behind or beside the presidential limousine. They were exempted from crowd control that might slow their movement. They were trained to fight through chaos to stay with the president regardless of circumstances. But the Dallas assassination had revealed a deeper question that couldn't be solved by keeping the aide closer. What happens if the president is incapacitated but alive? Who has authority to order nuclear launch? At what point does authority transfer to the vice president? And how do you make that determination when seconds might decide whether America's nuclear forces survive enemy first strike? These questions would be tested again, sooner than anyone expected. The nuclear football didn't begin with Kennedy. It began with Dwight Eisenhower, though almost no one knew it existed during his presidency. In 1956, Eisenhower ordered the creation of a portable communication system that would allow him to authorize nuclear retaliation from anywhere: the White House, Camp David, a golf course, or Air Force One. The system needed to be compact enough to be carried by a single military aide and secure enough to prevent unauthorized access. The result was a custom-made leather briefcase containing a radio transmitter, authentication materials, and targeting documents. It was first deployed in 1957, though its existence remained classified. The public didn't know that a military aide was carrying nuclear launch codes wherever Eisenhower went. Eisenhower understood nuclear weapons better than most presidents would. He had commanded millions of men in World War II. He understood military logistics, command structures, and the fog of war. And he understood that nuclear war would have to be fought according to pre-established plans because there would be no time for detailed presidential decision-making once attack began. The Single Integrated Operational Plan, PSYOP, was Eisenhower's solution to that problem. The PSYOP was a comprehensive nuclear war plan that listed every Soviet target, every American weapon assigned to strike those targets, and the sequence in which attacks would be executed. When nuclear war began, The president would select from a menu of pre-planned attack options rather than trying to make targeting decisions in real time. The football carried the PSYOP. And the PSYOP reflected Eisenhower's military philosophy: overwhelming force applied decisively. The first PSYOP, completed in 1960, called for launching essentially every nuclear weapon in the American arsenal at once, more than 3,200 weapons striking more than 1,000 targets throughout the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe. Estimated casualties: 600 million dead in the first hours. Eisenhower reviewed the PSYOP in December 1960, 1 month before leaving office. After reading the targeting plan and casualty estimates, he remarked to his staff, "This is a goddamned horror, but if we're attacked, there's no other choice but to execute it." The horror was the point. Nuclear deterrence depended on Soviet leadership, believing that American retaliation would be so devastating that no rational calculation could justify attack. The PSYOP ensured that even if Soviet first strike destroyed most American forces, enough weapons would survive to execute retaliation that would eliminate Soviet civilization. And all of it, the entire apocalyptic plan, fit into a briefcase weighing 45 pounds. When John F. Kennedy took office in January 1961, he inherited Eisenhower's nuclear briefcase and Eisenhower's PSYOP. Kennedy's first briefing on nuclear war plans horrified him. The PSYOP allowed for no flexibility, no graduated options, no ability to fight limited nuclear war. It was total annihilation or nothing. Kennedy ordered revision of the PSYOP to include more flexible options. The new plan, completed in 1962, offered alternatives ranging from limited strike on Soviet military forces to full-scale counter-value attack destroying Soviet cities. But even the most limited option in the new PSYOP called for launching hundreds of nuclear weapons. The football's contents were updated to reflect the new targeting options. Now the briefcase contained multiple attack plans from which the president could choose. But the fundamental concept remained unchanged. When nuclear war began, the president would select from the menu of pre-planned options, authenticate his identity using codes in the football, and Strategic Air Command would execute the selected plan. The system seemed rational, organized, and controlled, but it depended on assumptions that reality would challenge, that the president would remain conscious and capable during attack, that the football would remain close to presidential authority, that communication systems would function during nuclear war, that the time pressures would allow for presidential decision rather than forcing automatic execution of pre-planned options. Dallas challenged the first two assumptions. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1 year before Dallas, had challenged the others. Between the briefcase's creation under Eisenhower and its first public exposure in Dallas, it faced its most dangerous test, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. For 13 days, Kennedy carried the football everywhere as he managed the confrontation with Soviet Union over missiles in Cuba. Military aides later described the president's behavior during those days as obsessive focus on maintaining personal control over nuclear weapons. Kennedy didn't trust the military not to launch without his authorization. He didn't trust automatic systems. He trusted only his personal possession of the codes and his continuous oversight of military readiness. During the crisis, Kennedy slept in the White House residence with the military aide carrying the football stationed in the hallway outside his bedroom door. When Kennedy swam in the White House pool, the aide sat poolside with the briefcase. When Kennedy attended church, the aide sat in the pew directly behind him. The omnipresence of the football during those days revealed how nuclear command actually worked. It wasn't a sophisticated command and control system with multiple safeguards and careful verification. It was a briefcase, a handcuff, and a military officer trying to stay within sight of the president while the president tried to prevent nuclear war. The system worked during the Cuban crisis. The Soviets backed down. Nuclear war was averted, and the football returned to being an invisible presence that few Americans knew existed. But the crisis had shown Kennedy what Eisenhower had understood. Presidential control over nuclear weapons was a fragile thing, dependent on physical proximity, working communications, and the president remaining conscious and capable under extraordinary stress. 1 year after the Cuban crisis in Dallas, those dependencies would be tested in ways no one had anticipated. 1:45 p.m. Central Time, November 22, 1963. Love Field, Dallas. Major General Chester Clifton climbed the stairs to Air Force One, carrying the football. Inside the aircraft, Lyndon Johnson was preparing to take the oath of office as president. But before that ceremony, Clifton needed to brief Johnson on nuclear command procedures and transfer the football's authority to the new president. Johnson was in the aircraft's stateroom, still in shock from the events of the past hour. Clifton entered and approached the vice president, now president. The briefcase was no longer handcuffed to his wrist. He'd removed it in the chaos at Parkland Hospital, but he held it with both hands, conscious of its weight and significance. "Mr. President," Clifton began, "I need to brief you on emergency procedures." Johnson looked at the briefcase, then at Clifton. For a moment, neither man spoke. Both understood what the briefcase represented. Johnson, who had been in Congress during World War II and had lived through the dawn of the nuclear age, knew exactly what Clifton was holding. "Not now," Johnson said quietly. "After the oath, after we're airborne. Tell your people that nothing happens, nothing at all, without my direct order. Make sure they understand that." Clifton nodded. The message was clear. Johnson wanted explicit confirmation that nuclear forces would not act without his personal authorization. In the confusion and uncertainty following Kennedy's assassination, with tensions high and communications disrupted, Johnson's first instinct was to ensure that no one would launch nuclear weapons without his command. At 2:38 p.m., Lyndon Johnson took the oath of office aboard Air Force One, becoming the 36th President of the United States. The ceremony was brief, solemn, and conducted in the cramped space of the aircraft's main cabin. Jacqueline Kennedy stood beside Johnson, still wearing the suit stained with her husband's blood. After the oath, Air Force One departed Love Field for Washington. Once airborne, Johnson summoned Clifton to the presidential cabin for the full nuclear briefing. Clifton opened the football and began explaining its contents. The authentication card that Johnson would need to verify his identity when ordering nuclear launch, the biscuit, as it was called, a small laminated card with codes changed regularly, the communication equipment for reaching Strategic Air Command and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The PSYOP targeting documents showing the attack options available, and the procedures for actually authorizing launch, including the specific code words and authentication protocols. Johnson listened carefully, asking few questions. His primary concern was immediate. Were American nuclear forces at heightened alert status because of the assassination? Could anyone else order launch without his authority? What were the Soviets doing? Clifton assured him that American forces were at normal peacetime status. Strategic Air Command had not increased alert levels. The Soviets, according to latest intelligence, were showing no unusual military activity. Everything was stable. But that stability depended on Johnson's ability to exercise nuclear command authority, and that meant understanding what was in the briefcase now resting on the cabin table between them. The briefing lasted 30 minutes. By the end, Johnson understood the basics. If nuclear attack occurred, He would use the authentication card to verify his identity to Strategic Air Command. He would select attack option from the PSYOP documents. He would issue the launch order through the communication equipment in the football. And Strategic Air Command would execute the selected attack plan. It sounded straightforward. But Johnson, who had been vice president for nearly 3 years and had attended some National Security Council meetings on nuclear matters, understood the reality was more complex. The time pressures would be extreme. The decisions would be irreversible. And the weight of ordering actions that would kill hundreds of millions of people would fall entirely on him. After the briefing, Johnson did something that would become characteristic of his presidency. He asked Clifton a question that went to the human core of nuclear command. "General, if I order launch, will the weapons actually fire? Will the commanders execute the order?" Clifton understood what Johnson was really asking. In this moment of constitutional crisis, with one president murdered and another sworn in under extraordinary circumstances, would the military follow orders from the new president to launch nuclear war? Or would there be hesitation, confusion, perhaps even refusal? "Mr. President," Clifton replied carefully, "the commanders will execute your orders. The system is designed to ensure that authenticated presidential commands are carried out immediately and without question. That's the whole purpose of this briefcase, to prove that orders come from legitimate presidential authority." Johnson nodded slowly. But both men understood that Clifton's assurance was based on peacetime assumptions. No one truly knew how the system would function if nuclear crisis occurred during chaotic aftermath of presidential assassination. Would commanders believe that authentication codes proved legitimate authority? Or would they question whether the codes might have been compromised in the confusion? These questions had no answers because the situation had never occurred. The nuclear football had transferred from Kennedy's authority to Johnson's authority. But whether that transfer would hold under the pressure of actual nuclear crisis remained theoretical until tested. Air Force One landed at Andrews Air Force Base at 6:05 p.m. Eastern Time. Johnson departed with the football now assigned to a new military aide, Colonel James Cross, who would serve as Johnson's first nuclear football carrier. Cross had received hasty briefing at Love Field about his new responsibilities. Now he stood on the tarmac at Andrews, the briefcase handcuffed to his wrist, beginning a duty that would last for Johnson's entire presidency. The nuclear football had survived its first presidential transition under crisis conditions. The system had functioned, authority had transferred, command continuity had been maintained. But the vulnerabilities exposed in Dallas remained unresolved. Physical separation between president and football, unclear procedures for incapacitation scenarios, dependence on handcuffs, briefcases, and proximity rather than robust technical safeguards. These vulnerabilities would be tested again, and next time the outcome might not be as fortunate. The military aides who carry the nuclear football describe it as the loneliest duty in the armed forces. They're surrounded by people, but isolated by the knowledge of what they carry. They stand behind the president during speeches, during meetings, during photo opportunities, always visible but never acknowledged. They're in the background of thousands of photographs, unidentified men holding black briefcases, their faces showing the strain of constant vigilance. The weight isn't just physical, though 45 pounds becomes heavy after hours of standing. The weight is psychological, knowing that the briefcase handcuffed to your wrist contains the capability to end human civilization, and that your only job is to ensure it's available if the president needs it. The aides rotate every few months because the stress is cumulative. They dream about losing the briefcase. They wake at night imagining scenarios where they can't reach the president during attack. They develop superstitions and rituals, checking the handcuff lock repeatedly, touching the briefcase for reassurance, maintaining exact distance from the president as if proximity could protect against the chaos they've trained for, but hope never comes. And they know that if nuclear war begins, they'll be among the first casualties. Their duty is to stay close to the president. The president is the primary target. Therefore, the military aide carrying the football is standing at ground zero, handcuffed to the weapon that will respond to the attack that kills him. This knowledge shapes how the aides think about their duty. They're not protecting the president. They're ensuring that even if the president dies, even if Washington is destroyed, even if they themselves are killed in the first seconds of nuclear war, the briefcase's contents will reach whoever survives to exercise nuclear authority. They are, in the most literal sense, guardians of the apocalypse, and most Americans will never know their names. March 30th, 1981, 2:27 p.m. Eastern Time, Washington Hilton Hotel, Washington, D.C. President Ronald Reagan had just delivered a speech to AFL-CIO representatives. He exited through the hotel's VIP entrance on T Street, walking toward his armored limousine. Behind him, Major Thomas "Skip" Crosby carried the nuclear football, maintaining his standard three-pace distance. 6 shots rang out in rapid succession. Reagan crumpled against the limousine. Secret Service agent Jerry Parr shoved the president into the back seat and dove on top of him. The limousine accelerated away from the hotel before Crosby could reach the vehicle. For the second time in 18 years, a presidential assassination attempt had separated the president from the nuclear football. But this time was different from Dallas in critical ways. Reagan was conscious. The bullet wound, though serious, was not immediately fatal, and within minutes, Vice President George H.W. Bush and Secretary of State Alexander Haig would be asking the question that no one had fully answered since Kennedy's death: who has nuclear authority when the president is wounded but alive? Major Crosby, separated from Reagan's limousine, climbed into the follow-up vehicle with instructions to follow the president to George Washington University Hospital. But Secret Service agents initially refused to tell him where Reagan was being taken. Operational security prevented sharing presidential location, even with the officer carrying nuclear codes. Crosby had to argue, showing his military credentials and the handcuffed briefcase, before agents confirmed the president was en route to GW Hospital. By the time Crosby's vehicle reached the hospital, Reagan had already been taken inside for emergency surgery. At 3:30 p.m., Reagan was under general anesthesia in the operating room. He would remain unconscious for 3 hours during surgery to remove the bullet from his chest. Major Crosby stood outside the OR, the football handcuffed to his wrist, facing an unprecedented situation. The president was alive but incapacitated. The vice president was aboard Air Force Two, returning from Texas, and no clear procedures existed for who had nuclear authority in this exact scenario. At the White House Situation Room, chaos unfolded. Secretary of State Alexander Haig famously declared, "I am in control here," to reporters, incorrectly asserting his position in the line of presidential succession. Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger ordered increased alert status for American nuclear forces, and military commanders waited for clarity about who could authorize nuclear launch if Soviet attack occurred in the next few hours. The question came down to a laminated card the size of a credit card, the biscuit containing authentication codes that proved presidential identity. Reagan had carried his biscuit in his jacket pocket, as all presidents did. When Secret Service agents cut away his bloody jacket in the emergency room, they discarded it with the other clothing. The biscuit went into a bag with Reagan's wallet, keys, and other personal items, none of which were immediately secured. For several hours, no one could locate Reagan's authentication codes. The president was in surgery. The biscuit was missing. The vice president was in the air, And the nuclear command system faced a scenario that procedures hadn't fully addressed: incapacitation without death, wounded commander-in-chief who might recover, and authentication codes that had disappeared into hospital administrative chaos. Major Crosby maintained custody of the football throughout the crisis, but the football's contents were designed to work in conjunction with the president's personal authentication codes. Without Reagan's biscuit, the system couldn't function as designed. If nuclear launch had been necessary, improvised procedures would have been required. Vice President Bush finally reached the White House Situation Room at 7:00 p.m. By then, Reagan was out of surgery and recovering. No nuclear crisis had occurred during the vulnerable hours. The system had survived another test. But investigation after the incident revealed disturbing facts. Reagan's biscuit wasn't recovered from the hospital until 3 days later. It had been in a bag with his personal belongings mixed with other patients' items, potentially accessible to anyone with access to the emergency room storage area. For 3 days, the authentication codes for America's nuclear arsenal were lost in a hospital. The incident prompted immediate review of presidential protection procedures and nuclear command protocols. New rules required that presidential authentication codes be immediately secured by Secret Service in any medical emergency. Backup authentication procedures were developed for scenarios where the president's codes were lost or compromised. And clarity was finally established about the vice president's nuclear authority when the president was incapacitated but alive. But the review also revealed something that shocked even senior military officers. Reagan apparently hadn't carried his biscuit at all on March 30th. Investigation found the authentication card in his White House bedroom, left behind that morning. The president had gone to the speech without his nuclear codes. This meant that even if the football had stayed with Reagan, even if Major Crosby had remained at the president's side throughout the shooting and its aftermath, the system still wouldn't have functioned. Reagan couldn't have authenticated nuclear launch because he didn't have his codes. The revelation remained classified for years. Publicly, the administration maintained that nuclear command had transferred smoothly to the vice president during Reagan's surgery. Privately, the military and Secret Service were forced to confront the reality that their most important safeguard, the authentication code proving presidential identity, depended on the president remembering to carry a small laminated card. And if the president forgot it, as Reagan had on March 30th, the entire system failed. Colonel Robert Buzz Patterson, who would later serve as a military aide carrying the football during the Clinton administration, wrote about the Reagan incident years later. "We discovered that the system we'd built to control nuclear weapons wasn't actually a system. It was procedures and protocols that assumed everyone would remember their responsibilities and nothing would go wrong." When things went wrong, as they did on March 30th, 1981, we learned that presidential nuclear authority was far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. Reagan recovered fully from his wound. He served 2 complete terms as president, and he never forgot his authentication codes again. But the incident had revealed yet another vulnerability in nuclear command. The system depended not just on physical proximity between president and football, but on the president carrying authentication codes that could be forgotten, lost, or separated from presidential custody during medical emergencies. The nuclear football had proven itself vulnerable in Dallas. It had proven vulnerable again outside the Washington Hilton. And each test revealed new ways the system could fail when violence disrupted the careful procedures designed for orderly presidential command. The Reagan shooting exposed the most fundamental vulnerability in nuclear command. It depends on humans remembering to do simple things under normal conditions and maintaining complex procedures under crisis conditions. The president must remember to carry authentication codes, The military aide must stay close to the president. Secret Service must coordinate with military aides during emergencies. Hospital personnel must secure presidential belongings. Vice presidents must be reachable during crises. And all of this must function perfectly when chaos intervenes. The system had been designed by military planners and engineers who assumed rational actors, clear procedures, and orderly command structures. But assassination attempts were neither rational nor orderly. They were sudden violence that shattered all assumptions about how situations would unfold. After March 30th, 1981, the procedures were revised again. Presidents received additional training on the importance of carrying authentication codes. Military aides were given priority access to presidential medical treatment to ensure the football remained secure. Backup authentication procedures were developed, and explicit protocols finally addressed the incapacitation scenario, but each fix addressed only the specific failure mode that had been exposed. The underlying vulnerability remained. A system designed for control and order being tested by chaos and violence, and each test revealed that the system's reliability depended more on luck and improvisation than on robust engineering. The next major test would come from an unexpected direction. Not violence against the president, but violence against the symbols of American power in an age when terrorists understood that creating chaos was more effective than confronting military might directly. September 11th, 2001, 8:46 a.m. Eastern Time. President George W. Bush was visiting Emma E. Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida, reading to second graders as part of an education initiative event. Major Scott Crosby stood against the classroom wall, the nuclear football at his feet, watching the president interact with the children. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower. By 9:05 a.m., Secret Service and military aides were whispering urgently to each other in the hallway outside the classroom. America was under attack. Chief of Staff Andrew Card entered the classroom at 9:06 a.m. and whispered to Bush, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." Bush continued reading to the children for several more minutes, maintaining composure while his mind raced through implications. Major Crosby watched the president's face, seeing the calculation: finish the commitment to these children, then deal with the crisis. At 9:12 a.m., Bush excused himself from the classroom. Crosby immediately moved to the president's side, football in hand. Secret Service agents formed protective ring around Bush and began moving him rapidly toward the motorcade. The plan: get to Air Force One immediately and get airborne. Unknown number of hijacked aircraft were still in the air. Washington might be under attack. The president needed to be mobile and secure. But as the motorcade raced toward Sarasota Bradenton International Airport, communications began breaking down. The secure phone lines that the football depended on for reaching Strategic Air Command weren't connecting properly. Cell phone networks were overloaded, and, most critically, no one knew how many more attacks were coming or where they might strike. Air Force One took off at 9:54 a.m. without filing a flight plan. Bush demanded to return to Washington immediately. Secret Service insisted that Washington was too dangerous. Reports indicated another hijacked plane might be heading for the capital. Bush and his advisers began arguing about whether the president should return to D.C. or go to a secure location. At 9:37 a.m., while Air Force One was still preparing for takeoff, American Airlines Flight 77 had struck the Pentagon. The building that housed National Military Command Center, the primary node for nuclear command and control, was on fire. The secure communication systems that linked the president to nuclear forces ran through Pentagon facilities that were now damaged or evacuated. This created an unprecedented situation. The president was airborne on Air Force One with the primary nuclear football, but the communication systems the football depended on were compromised. The Pentagon was evacuated, and it was unclear whether the football's radio equipment could reach Strategic Air Command through alternate channels if nuclear launch became necessary. Vice President Dick Cheney was in a different location facing his own crisis. At 9:58 a.m., Secret Service agents had physically lifted Cheney and carried him from his West Wing office to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, the PEOC, a hardened bunker beneath the White House East Wing. In the confusion, Cheney had been separated from his military aide carrying the backup nuclear football. The backup football existed precisely for situations like this. If the president was killed or incapacitated, the vice president could assume nuclear authority using the backup system. But in the chaos of September 11th, Secret Service agents had moved Cheney so rapidly that his military aide couldn't keep pace. For several minutes, Cheney was in the secure bunker without access to nuclear codes or communication equipment. The aide, Lieutenant Commander Anthony Barnes, arrived at the PEOC entrance at 10:03 a.m., out of breath from running through the White House with 45 pounds of equipment handcuffed to his wrist. Security initially refused to allow him into the secure bunker because his credentials hadn't been pre-cleared for PEOC access. Barnes had to argue with guards while Cheney was inside making decisions about intercepting potentially hijacked aircraft. Meanwhile, aboard Air Force One, President Bush faced his own communication problems. The football's secure communication systems were designed to work from fixed presidential locations like the White House or Camp David, or from Air Force One when parked at known locations with proper ground infrastructure. But Air Force One was flying at 45,000 feet, constantly changing direction based on Secret Service threat assessments, without established communication links. Major Crosby attempted to establish contact with Strategic Air Command using the football's equipment. The connections were intermittent, voice quality was poor, and most critically, the authentication procedures that would verify Bush's identity to SAC commanders weren't designed for the improvised communication channels they were forced to use. By 10:30 a.m., 3 nuclear footballs were in play. The primary football with Bush on Air Force One, flying toward an undetermined destination with unreliable communications, the backup football with Cheney in the PEOC bunker, now accessible but with unclear authority since Bush was alive and actively commanding, and a tertiary emergency football kept at U.S. Strategic Command Headquarters, unused but ready if both presidential and vice presidential systems failed. At 11:45 a.m., Bush made the decision to fly to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, which had secure communication facilities and could support proper nuclear command connectivity. Air Force One landed at Barksdale at 12:36 p.m. Central Time. Finally, nearly 4 hours after the attacks began, Bush had reliable communication with nuclear forces and could properly execute command authority if necessary. But those 4 hours had revealed critical vulnerabilities. The football's communication systems weren't designed for sustained airborne operations during national emergency. Procedures for vice presidential nuclear authority during crisis were unclear. Physical security of the backup football depended on Secret Service agents remembering to keep the military aide with the vice president during evacuations. And the entire system had trouble functioning when normal communication infrastructure was disrupted or destroyed. Investigation after September 11th showed how close the system had come to complete breakdown. If Soviet or Chinese nuclear forces had launched attack during the 4 hours when presidential communications were degraded, response procedures would have required improvisation. Authentication would have been difficult, command authority would have been ambiguous, and execution of nuclear war plans would have depended on field commanders making judgment calls about whether orders they were receiving were legitimate. The same pattern that had emerged in Dallas and at the Reagan shooting repeated on September 11th. When crisis disrupted normal procedures, the nuclear command system revealed itself to be far more fragile than peacetime planning suggested. The football worked perfectly in routine conditions, but routine conditions were precisely when nuclear command didn't matter. It was during chaos and emergency that the system needed to function flawlessly, and during chaos, it barely functioned at all. Colonel Buzz Patterson, who had carried the football for President Clinton from 1996 to 1998, wrote about September 11th years later. That day exposed what those of us who'd carried the football already knew. The system worked because we were lucky. We were lucky that no nuclear crisis occurred during those 4 hours. We were lucky that communications eventually were re-established. We were lucky that terrorists attacked with airplanes instead of with coordinated assault that might have separated multiple people in the nuclear chain of command. We survived September 11th not because our nuclear command system was robust, but because we weren't tested by nuclear crisis at the same moment we were tested by terrorist attack. September 11th marked a fundamental shift in how nuclear command planners thought about threats. During the Cold War, the threat was clear: Soviet nuclear attack. The procedures, communication systems, and presidential protection protocols were all designed around that single scenario. But September 11th demonstrated that threats could come from unexpected directions: terrorists hijacking civilian aircraft, attacks on communication infrastructure, multiple simultaneous crises, and scenarios where the president might need nuclear authority while the entire government was evacuating, dispersing, or dealing with attacks on American soil. The nuclear football had been designed for Cold War predictability. It struggled with post-9/11 chaos. Over the following years, the football's contents and supporting systems were modernized. Communication equipment was upgraded to work from more varied locations and conditions. Backup authentication procedures were formalized. Training scenarios incorporated terrorist attacks, infrastructure failures, and multiple simultaneous crises. But the fundamental architecture remained unchanged: a briefcase, a handcuff, a military aide, and procedures that assumed presidential access to communication systems during crisis. That architecture had proven vulnerable in Dallas, in the Reagan shooting, and on September 11th, and each vulnerability revealed that nuclear command depended less on technology than on human adaptability when technology failed. The next generation of threats would come not from hijacked aircraft or bullets, but from the invisible warfare of the digital age. Cyber attacks that could potentially compromise the football's communication systems, spoof authentication protocols, or create confusion about whether commands were legitimate. These threats would test the football in ways that Cold War planners had never imagined. The nuclear football's most persistent vulnerability isn't technological. It's mundane. Presidents are human beings who forget things, lose things, and sometimes fail to treat small laminated cards containing nuclear authentication codes with the gravity those codes deserve. Jimmy Carter discovered this in August 1981, 4 months after leaving office. The former president was sorting through clothing for charity donation when he found a small laminated card in the pocket of a suit he hadn't worn since his final days in the White House. He stared at it for a moment before recognition set in. It was his presidential authentication code card, his biscuit. the card that proved his authority to launch nuclear weapons. Carter had carried that card for 4 years. When he left office in January 1981, he was supposed to return it to military aides for destruction. Instead, it had gone home with him in his jacket pocket, forgotten in the transition chaos. For 7 months, the authentication codes for a former president had been in Carter's closet. Carter immediately contacted the White House to report the oversight. Military investigators arrived within hours to retrieve the card and determine if compromise had occurred. Investigation concluded that the codes had been changed when Reagan took office, so Carter's old biscuit was no longer valid. But the incident revealed embarrassing reality. No one had noticed that Carter hadn't returned his authentication codes. No inventory had caught the missing biscuit. The system for controlling nuclear codes relied on presidents remembering to return them. The Carter incident wasn't unique. Investigation after Reagan's March 1981 shooting, when his biscuit had gone missing at the hospital, had uncovered other cases where authentication codes had been mishandled. Gerald Ford had accidentally put his biscuit through a washing machine in 1974 when he forgot to empty his pockets. The laminated card survived the wash cycle, but the codes were water-damaged and barely legible. Ford had to use the damaged card for 3 days until replacement codes could be properly generated and distributed. Richard Nixon, during the final days of his presidency in August 1974, when he was drinking heavily and behaving erratically, had reportedly lost his biscuit entirely. Military aides had quietly issued him a replacement without reporting the loss because they feared publicizing that the president, under immense stress, had misplaced nuclear codes would create additional crisis. Lyndon Johnson had habitually left his authentication card in his bedroom at night, believing it was safe there. This meant that if nuclear attack had occurred between midnight and 6 a.m. during Johnson's presidency, the president would have needed several minutes to retrieve his codes from a different room before authenticating launch orders, and Bill Clinton would later lose his biscuit entirely during his presidency. Investigation never determined where or when Clinton lost the card. It was simply gone one day during a routine inventory check. Clinton had apparently been carrying a replacement card issued years earlier instead of his current card, without realizing the codes had changed. For an unknown period of time, possibly several months, Clinton had been carrying outdated codes that wouldn't authenticate his identity to nuclear forces. These incidents revealed the absurdity at the heart of nuclear command. The most powerful weapon system ever created, capable of ending human civilization, depended on presidents treating a laminated card no bigger than a credit card as if it were the most important thing they owned. And presidents, being human, sometimes forgot, lost, or damaged those cards just like they might lose their car keys or forget their wallets. Colonel Buzz Patterson described the biscuit problem in his 2003 memoir. Every military aide who carries the football lives in constant fear that the president will lose his authentication codes. We check with the president daily. "Sir, do you have your biscuit?" We've developed subtle ways to confirm without directly asking in public, "Mr. President, do you have everything you need?" We know that if the president loses the biscuit and we don't catch it, if nuclear crisis occurs and the president can't authenticate, we've failed at our primary duty. So we become obsessive about this little card that presidents sometimes treat like pocket change. The solution seemed obvious. Make the codes impossible to lose. Embed them in something the president always carries, like a watch or ring. Or provide redundant authentication systems that don't depend on a single card. But every alternative solution created new vulnerabilities. Electronic authentication systems could be hacked or spoofed. Biometric systems could fail during crisis when presidential stress responses might alter measurable characteristics, and backup systems created confusion about which codes were current and valid. So the military stuck with the laminated card, despite its vulnerability to being forgotten, lost, washed, or left in White House bedrooms. And military aides carrying the football continued to develop euphemisms for asking presidents whether they had their nuclear codes, trying to balance security requirements against the awkwardness of repeatedly asking the most powerful person on earth whether they remembered to bring their homework. The absurdity reached its peak during Bill Clinton's presidency, when the president's biscuit went missing and wasn't discovered to be lost for several months. Clinton appeared to have simply stopped checking whether he had the card. His military aides didn't want to alarm him by asking too frequently, and no one established definitive timeline for when the codes were last confirmed present versus when they were discovered missing. This meant that during an unknown portion of Clinton's presidency, if nuclear crisis had occurred, the president would have discovered at the moment of maximum crisis that he couldn't authenticate launch orders. Backup procedures existed for that scenario, but they required time and additional verification steps, time that might not be available if attack was imminent. The lesson from the biscuit incidents was uncomfortable. Nuclear command security depended less on sophisticated technology than on presidents' personal discipline. And personal discipline was precisely what tended to deteriorate under the stress, distraction, and chaos of presidential responsibilities. The military aides who carry the nuclear football exist in strange twilight between crucial importance and complete invisibility. They're in thousands of photographs, always in the background, never identified. They stand behind presidents during speeches, during negotiations, during moments that define history. And their contribution to those moments is to simply be there, carrying a briefcase, waiting for the crisis that they hope never comes. The selection process for football carriers is exhaustive. Years of military service, security clearances that require investigation into every aspect of their lives, psychological evaluation to ensure they can handle the stress, and physical fitness to carry 45 pounds for hours while maintaining constant vigilance. Then months of training on the football's contents, nuclear war plans, communication procedures, and the protocols for maintaining custody during crisis. And after all that preparation, their actual duty is to stand still, hold a briefcase, and wait. Hours of waiting, days of waiting, years of waiting for the moment when the president turns and says, "I need the football," and their training suddenly matters more than anything in the world. Most football carriers serve their tours without that moment ever coming. They carry the briefcase through presidential trips, state dinners, golf games, and vacations. They maintain the equipment, update the codes, practice the procedures. And then they rotate to new assignments, their service notable primarily for nothing having happened. But they know that their job is defined by the exceptions. The moments when something does happen, when procedure breaks down, when they have to improvise to ensure nuclear command continuity. Dallas. The Reagan shooting. September 11th. Those were the days when being the person carrying the football mattered in ways that peaceful service never revealed. And they know that someday, perhaps during their watch or perhaps during someone else's, there might come a moment when everything depends on their ability to hand the president a briefcase while the world is ending. That knowledge shapes how they think about their duty and why they describe it as the loneliest job in the military. April 29th, 1975. Saigon, South Vietnam. The war was ending. North Vietnamese forces surrounded the city. American personnel and Vietnamese allies crowded the embassy compound waiting for helicopter evacuation. And somewhere in the chaos, a military aide carrying a nuclear football was trying to reach the last helicopters off the roof. The aide was Air Force Major James Keane, assigned to Ambassador Graham Martin's security detail. Martin, technically representing presidential authority in Vietnam, had been assigned a football to ensure nuclear command connectivity if crisis occurred while he was in country. The football had seemed like bureaucratic overkill during the years when American combat involvement wound down. Now, as Saigon fell, it seemed like dangerous liability. Keane fought through crowds surrounding the embassy, the football handcuffed to his wrist, trying to reach the helicopter landing zone on the roof. Marines were controlling access, prioritizing Vietnamese allies and embassy personnel. Keane had to physically push through the crowd, shouting that he carried classified material that could not fall into North Vietnamese hands. At one point, a Marine lieutenant challenged Keane, demanding to see identification before allowing him to pass. Keane, in a moment of absurd formality during absolute chaos, showed his military ID and explained that the briefcase contained nuclear launch codes that had to be evacuated. The lieutenant, clearly not briefed on the football's presence in Saigon, stared at Keane as if he'd lost his mind. Then he waved him through, apparently deciding that anyone claiming to carry nuclear codes was either telling the truth or insane enough to be someone else's problem. Keane reached the roof at 7:45 p.m. The last helicopters were loading. He climbed aboard a CH-46 Sea Knight already overloaded with evacuees. The football, still handcuffed to his wrist, took up valuable space in the crowded helicopter. Several Vietnamese refugees had to shift position to make room for the briefcase that they couldn't know contained the capability to end the world. The helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof at 7:53 p.m. Below, North Vietnamese forces were entering Saigon. Within hours, the war would officially end with South Vietnam's surrender. Major Keane sat in the crowded helicopter, the football between his knees, thinking about the absurdity of his situation. America had just lost a war, evacuated in humiliation from a country where 58,000 Americans had died, and in the midst of that historical defeat, military protocol had required ensuring that a briefcase full of nuclear codes made it safely out of the country. The incident raised questions that had never been seriously addressed. Why did an ambassador need a nuclear football? What scenario involving the fall of Saigon would have required nuclear launch authority? And what would have happened if Major Keane hadn't made it to the last helicopter? Would nuclear codes have fallen into North Vietnamese hands? Investigation after the Saigon evacuation revealed that multiple backup nuclear footballs existed beyond the primary presidential system. Senior military commanders in combat zones carried versions of the football to ensure nuclear command connectivity if communication with Washington failed during crisis. Ambassadors in high-risk countries like Vietnam during the war years had them for similar reasons, and special emergency footballs were stored at Strategic Command and other secure facilities as ultimate backups if all other systems failed. This meant that the nuclear football was actually plural. Several briefcases containing authentication equipment and targeting plans distributed globally to ensure that someone, somewhere, could execute nuclear launch if presidential command failed. The system prioritized ensuring that nuclear retaliation remained possible even after catastrophic attacks on American leadership over the risk that multiple footballs might increase the chance of codes being lost or compromised. The Saigon evacuation also revealed another uncomfortable reality. Nuclear command procedures had been designed for Cold War scenarios involving Soviet attack, not for the messy counterinsurgency wars America actually fought. The football that nearly got left behind in Saigon existed because procedures said senior diplomatic personnel in conflict zones needed nuclear authority. But those procedures had been written assuming conflicts where nuclear use might be relevant. The fall of Saigon was many things, but it was never a situation where nuclear weapons would have been appropriate response. Yet the football went to Saigon anyway because the system was rigid. If you were senior enough and in a place designated as potential crisis zone, you got a football. Whether that made strategic sense was secondary to ensuring complete nuclear command coverage. Major Keane delivered the Saigon football to Strategic Air Command headquarters 3 days after the evacuation. The codes were changed immediately in case they had been compromised during the chaotic extraction. The briefcase itself was inspected, refurbished, and returned to service for the next diplomat or commander who would carry it into the next crisis. Years later, after the Cold War ended, military historians studying the fall of Saigon discovered that North Vietnamese intelligence had known about the football's presence in the embassy during the final days. They had specific orders to capture it if possible during the embassy seizure. If Major Keane had been delayed by even a few minutes, if the crowd had prevented him from reaching the roof, if the last helicopter had departed without him, the nuclear football would have been the most significant intelligence prize of North Vietnam's victory. The codes would have been changed immediately once the loss was discovered, making the captured authentication information useless. But the targeting documents, communication procedures, and technical details of how America controlled nuclear weapons would have been invaluable to Soviet intelligence, which certainly would have received complete access to any captured football. The Saigon evacuation remains the only time a nuclear football came close to being captured by enemy forces. But it wouldn't be the only time the football faced threats beyond the traditional scenarios of assassination or nuclear crisis. The modern era would bring new challenges. Terrorists who might target the football specifically, cyber threats to the communication systems, and the chaos of an interconnected world where presidential movements were constantly tracked and potentially vulnerable to attack. The briefcase that had survived Dallas, the Reagan shooting, and September 11th would face tests that Cold War planners had never imagined. The existence of multiple nuclear footballs distributed to commanders and diplomats around the world created a security paradox. The system needed to ensure nuclear retaliation remained possible even after catastrophic leadership decapitation. But achieving that resilience required distributing nuclear codes to multiple locations, multiplying the potential for loss, compromise, or unauthorized use. During the Cold War's peak, as many as a dozen nuclear footballs existed simultaneously. The presidential football, the vice presidential backup, 3 briefcases for senior military commanders in different regions, 2 diplomatic footballs for ambassadors in high-risk posts, and several emergency footballs stored at secure facilities. Each contained similar authentication and communication equipment, though with hierarchical procedures ensuring that only presidential authority could actually initiate launch unless higher levels of command had been destroyed. The distribution made sense from a survivability perspective. If Washington was destroyed by Soviet first strike, at least one football would likely survive to enable retaliation, but it created logistical nightmares for security. Tracking a dozen briefcases, ensuring codes in all of them were updated simultaneously, maintaining communication equipment across multiple systems, and preventing any single football from being lost, stolen, or compromised. Several incidents tested this distributed system. In 1968, a backup football being transported aboard a military aircraft crashed in Greenland when the plane suffered catastrophic failure. The football was recovered from the wreckage, and its contents were verified as undamaged. But for several hours, military investigators faced the possibility that nuclear codes might have been scattered across Greenland ice. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, DEFCON 3 alert status meant that multiple military footballs were activated and deployed with commanders who might need them during the crisis. The increased operational tempo led to confusion about which codes were current and which systems were primary. For approximately 6 hours during the peak of the crisis, 2 different authentication systems were technically active, creating potential for conflicting orders if launch had been necessary. And in 1983, during exercise Able Archer, heightened tensions led to similar activation of backup systems. Soviet intelligence noted unusual American communication patterns and interpreted them as potential preparation for nuclear first strike, when actually they were confusion about which football had precedence during simulated crisis conditions. These incidents led to gradual reduction in the number of distributed footballs. By the 1990s, only the presidential and vice presidential systems remained in regular use, with emergency backups kept secure but not actively deployed. The trade-off was accepted: reduced survivability in exchange for improved security and clearer command authority. But the reduction created new vulnerability. If both president and vice president were killed or incapacitated, nuclear command would depend on backup systems that weren't continuously maintained or familiar to the commanders who might need to use them. The system had traded one type of fragility for another, continuing the pattern of nuclear command depending on hope that specific catastrophic scenarios wouldn't occur. In 2010, the Obama administration initiated the most comprehensive modernization of the nuclear football since its creation under Eisenhower. The goal: replace the aging communication equipment from the 1980s with modern digital systems that would provide better encryption, more reliable connectivity, and integration with contemporary nuclear command networks. The modernization seemed straightforward: swap old analog radio equipment for new digital communication systems, update the physical targeting documents with tablet computers containing electronic versions of the PSYOP, replace the clunky authentication hardware with modern secure identification technology, make the football lighter, more capable, and more secure. The contractors working on the modernization were some of America's most trusted defense firms, with decades of experience building secure military systems. The new equipment underwent exhaustive testing to ensure it met all security requirements. And in 2013, the first modernized football entered service, carried by a military aide following President Obama. 3 months later, Pentagon cybersecurity analysts discovered a disturbing vulnerability. The new digital communication system in the football was theoretically vulnerable to a specific type of cyber attack that could potentially spoof authentication signals. The vulnerability was subtle and would require a sophisticated attacker with access to classified information about the football's communication protocols. But it existed. The discovery triggered emergency review of all modernization work. Analysis revealed that by making the football smarter, adding digital processing, network connectivity, and computer-based authentication, the modernization had introduced vulnerabilities that the old analog system hadn't possessed. An analog radio couldn't be hacked. It could fail mechanically, but it couldn't be compromised by software vulnerabilities or cyber attacks. The digital replacement was more capable in normal conditions, but potentially more vulnerable during adversarial conditions. The dilemma was fundamental. Modern communication requires digital systems. Digital systems require software. Software contains vulnerabilities. Therefore, any modernization that made the football more capable also made it more vulnerable to cyber threats. Pentagon cybersecurity experts spent 18 months analyzing the problem. Their conclusion was sobering. The football's digital systems were likely more secure than any other military communication network, having received extraordinary investment in security measures. But more secure didn't mean invulnerable. Nation-state adversaries with sufficient resources could potentially develop attacks against the football's digital systems. The specific threat scenario that concerned experts was sophisticated. An adversary couldn't directly hack the football to cause unauthorized launch. Too many safeguards prevented that. But they might be able to compromise the communication systems during crisis, creating confusion about whether orders were legitimate, spoof authentication signals to make legitimate orders appear false, or cause system failures at the moment when reliable communication was most critical. The nightmare scenario: nuclear crisis occurs. President orders retaliation. Football's communication systems have been compromised by prepositioned cyber attack. Orders don't reach Strategic Air Command or reach them in corrupted form that fails authentication. Precious minutes are lost while alternate communication channels are established. Enemy first strike destroys American nuclear forces before retaliation can be executed. Or worse, adversary spoofs authentication signals, making unauthorized commands appear to come from legitimate presidential authority. Strategic Air Command receives what seems to be valid launch order. They execute, starting nuclear war based on forged command. Both scenarios were theoretically possible with digital systems in ways they hadn't been with analog equipment. The old system's limitation was also its strength. It could only do what it was mechanically capable of doing. Digital systems could do far more, which meant adversaries could potentially manipulate them to do things they weren't intended to do. The Pentagon's response was to implement multiple redundant security layers. Hardware authentication that couldn't be spoofed by software. Physical verification procedures that required human confirmation at multiple points, and maintenance of analog backup systems in case digital systems failed or were compromised. But the redundancy created its own problems. If digital systems indicated attack and analog backups showed nothing, which did you trust? If authentication succeeded through one path but failed through another, was the order legitimate? The complexity meant that operators needed to make judgment calls about which systems to trust, introducing human uncertainty into procedures designed to eliminate doubt. Colonel James McDonough, who served as a military aide carrying the football during Obama's second term, described the technology dilemma in a 2018 interview. Every time we made the football more sophisticated, we made it more capable but also more vulnerable. The old system was simple: radio, codes, procedures. You knew what it could do and what it couldn't do. The new system can do amazing things: secure video, data links, integration with other command systems. But every capability is also a potential vulnerability. We traded simplicity and certainty for capability and complexity. I'm not sure that trade was wise when the system's purpose is to work perfectly during the worst day in human history. The modernization continued despite these concerns because the alternative was keeping decades-old equipment in service. By 2015, the football's pre-modernization communication systems were so outdated that replacement parts were no longer manufactured. The equipment was literally irreplaceable. Modernization wasn't just about adding capability, it was about maintaining any capability at all. But the cyber vulnerability concerns led to unusual decision. The modernized football would contain both digital and analog systems. If digital systems failed or were suspected of compromise, the aide could switch to analog backup. The football became heavier, 50 pounds instead of 45, because it now carried redundant systems. but the redundancy was judged necessary given the cyber threat environment. In 2017, during the Trump administration, those concerns proved prescient. Pentagon cybersecurity analysts detected attempted intrusion into military communication networks that appeared designed to map the nuclear command system's architecture. The intrusion was traced to Foreign Intelligence Service and was blocked before achieving its objectives. But the attempt showed that adversaries were actively probing for vulnerabilities in nuclear command systems. Investigation after the intrusion attempt revealed that attackers had specifically sought information about the football's communication protocols, suggesting they knew the system had been digitized and were looking for ways to exploit that digitization. The attempt failed, but it confirmed that the theoretical cyber threats to the football weren't just theoretical. They were actual adversary priorities. The incident led to immediate security reviews and additional protective measures, but it also led to uncomfortable realization. The football would be a target for cyber attack during any future crisis. Adversaries wouldn't need to physically capture the briefcase or kill the president. They could potentially achieve similar effects by compromising the communication systems, creating confusion and delay during the minutes when clarity and speed were most critical. The technology trap had closed. Modern warfare required modern communication systems. Modern communication systems required digital technology. Digital technology created cyber vulnerabilities. And cyber vulnerabilities to nuclear command systems created risks that no amount of defensive security could completely eliminate. The football that had begun as a simple radio and a briefcase full of codes had evolved into a sophisticated computer system vulnerable to threats that Eisenhower-era planners had never imagined. And each evolution toward greater capability brought new vulnerabilities that previous generations of the system had avoided by being simpler. The nuclear football's history is a series of trade-offs: capability versus simplicity, security versus survivability, speed versus verification. Each generation of the system tried to optimize these trade-offs, and each generation discovered that optimizing one value degraded another. The original system was simple: analog radio, paper codes, physical authentication. It was limited in capability, but hard to compromise and easy to understand. Modernization added capability but introduced complexity that created new failure modes. The distributed system with multiple footballs ensured survivability but multiplied security risks. Consolidation improved security but created single points of failure. Digital systems enabled better communication but opened cyber vulnerabilities. Maintaining analog backups preserved security but meant carrying obsolete equipment that might not work with modern command networks. Every improvement solved one problem while creating another, and the fundamental challenge remained unchanged. The system needed to work perfectly during conditions where nothing else was working, when infrastructure was destroyed, when leadership was dead or incapacitated, when time was measured in minutes and mistakes couldn't be corrected. No system could meet all those requirements simultaneously. So each generation made different compromises, hoping their particular set of trade-offs would prove adequate when tested by real crisis. So far, that hope had held. The football had survived Dallas, the Reagan shooting, September 11th, Saigon, and multiple technological transitions. But each test revealed that survival depended as much on luck as on planning. And luck, by definition, eventually runs out. Bolling Air Force Base, Washington, D.C., 2019. Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood in a secure training facility, the nuclear football handcuffed to her wrist, facing the most stressful day of her military career. She was completing the final evaluation before being certified to carry the football for the president. The evaluation was designed to test not her knowledge — she'd already proven she knew procedures — but her ability to function under pressure that simulated the worst moments in American history. The scenario began calmly. Chen accompanied a role player representing the president through a simulated schedule of meetings. Her job was to maintain possession of the football, stay within sight of the president, and respond to routine requests for information about nuclear force status. For the first hour, nothing unusual happened. Chen began to relax slightly, thinking the evaluation might not be as intense as she'd feared. Then the simulation turned violent. Role players simulating Secret Service agents suddenly shouted, "Attack! Get down!" Loud gunshots rang out from speakers. The president role player collapsed, simulating assassination. Other role players created chaos, shouting, running, grabbing Chen, and trying to separate her from the football. The scenario deliberately replicated Dallas. Sudden violence, confusion, president down, football carrier separated from motorcade. Chen's training kicked in. She protected the football's physical custody first. No one could take it from her. She assessed the president's condition. The role player was unconscious, but alive. She needed to reach the vice president, but had no immediate way to locate him in the chaos. She made rapid decisions about which communication channels to use from the football's equipment, knowing that some might be compromised if the attack was coordinated. Evaluators watched her performance, noting every decision. The scenario continued for 20 minutes of simulated crisis before evaluators called time. Chen's hands were shaking from adrenaline. Her heart rate, monitored during the evaluation, had spiked to 180 beats per minute. But she had maintained custody of the football, made defensible decisions about communication protocols, and successfully simulated transfer of authority to the vice president. The assassination simulation was only the first scenario. Over the following 6 hours, Chen faced a series of crisis simulations. Nuclear attack warning while president was traveling internationally, requiring use of the football's equipment to establish communication with Strategic Air Command through foreign communication infrastructure. President's sudden medical emergency, requiring rapid determination of whether he was capable of exercising nuclear authority or whether power needed to transfer to vice president. Communication system failure that required switching to backup systems while under time pressure to authorize retaliation. Cyber attack on command networks that created conflicting information about whether orders were legitimate. Physical assault attempting to capture the football, requiring Chen to use defensive tactics while protecting the briefcase. Each scenario tested different aspects of the job: technical knowledge, physical capability, judgment under pressure, ability to improvise when procedures didn't cover the exact situation, and psychological resilience when facing simulated catastrophes that real football carriers might someday face in reality. The evaluation concluded with written examination that was intentionally unsettling. Questions about worst-case scenarios with no clear right answers. Questions designed to assess whether Chen understood that sometimes there were only bad options and less bad options. Questions about moral responsibility for carrying the capability to end civilization. The final question was simple and devastating. If you believe the president is ordering nuclear launch based on false information or during psychological crisis, what do you do? There was no correct answer. Military discipline required executing lawful orders from the president. But launching nuclear war based on false alarm or during presidential incapacity would be a catastrophic mistake. The question was designed to force candidates to confront the reality that they might someday face that impossible choice. Chen wrote her answer carefully. I would execute the order while simultaneously using all available channels to alert senior military leadership that authentication is occurring under questionable circumstances. I would document my concerns, but I would not prevent execution of a lawful order from the President. The decision about whether the order is appropriate rests with the President and the chain of command, not with me. The answer demonstrated that she understood the conflict between duty and judgment, and that she defaulted to duty while creating mechanism for others to intervene if necessary. It was the answer evaluators looked for: acknowledgement of the moral complexity without claiming personal authority to overrule presidential decisions. Lieutenant Chen passed her evaluation. She was certified to carry the nuclear football and began her rotation in that duty. Over the following 2 years, she would carry the briefcase through presidential trips, state dinners, golf weekends, and daily White House routines. The crisis scenarios she'd trained for never occurred during her watch. She rotated to a new assignment, having served her time carrying the apocalypse without ever needing to use it. But the training she'd received stayed with her. The knowledge that nuclear command depended on human judgment during the moments when judgment was hardest. The awareness that procedures couldn't cover every situation and someone would have to improvise when chaos overwhelmed planning. And the weight of understanding that the briefcase she'd carried, the procedures she'd memorized, and the decisions she'd trained to make were all that stood between civilization and its potential end. Every military aide who carried the football went through similar evaluations. Everyone faced the same scenarios, the same questions, the same psychological weight. And everyone rotated out of the duty, knowing that they had been guardian of something too important to ever discuss casually and too terrifying to think about for long. The human element was both the system's greatest strength and its most persistent vulnerability. Humans could adapt when technology failed. Humans could make judgments when procedures didn't fit circumstances, but humans could also panic, make mistakes, forget critical steps, or freeze when action was required. The football's security depended on selecting humans who were least likely to fail under maximum stress. But no selection process could guarantee perfect performance during actual nuclear crisis. So the military chose carefully, trained extensively, evaluated ruthlessly, and hoped that when the moment came, if it ever came, the person carrying the football would be capable of doing what needed to be done. So far, that hope had held, but hope was not strategy, and the human carriers of the nuclear football understood better than anyone that their success rate was 100%, only because they hadn't yet been truly tested by the crisis they trained for every day. Mental health professionals who work with nuclear command personnel describe a specific type of stress: anticipatory traumatic stress. It's the psychological burden of preparing constantly for catastrophe that you hope never comes, knowing that if it does come, you'll be at the center of humanity's worst moment. Football carriers describe it as living in permanent low-level anxiety punctuated by moments of acute fear during any unexpected alert or sudden change in routine. They dream about dropping the briefcase, about being separated from the president during attack, about making the wrong decision during crisis. They develop superstitions and rituals designed to maintain sense of control over situation where they have almost no control. Some carriers report feeling isolated even when surrounded by people. The briefcase creates barrier between them and normal human interaction. They can't discuss their duty in detail. They can't explain why certain things make them anxious. They can't share the weight they carry, literal and psychological, with anyone who doesn't have similar clearances and similar experience. The rotation system exists partly for this reason. No one should carry that weight for too long. Tours typically last 12 to 18 months. Some carriers request early rotation because the stress becomes unbearable. Others want to extend their service because they feel responsibility to see it through. After rotating out, carriers often struggle with sense of loss. They've been at the center of power, carrying the most important object in the world, trusted with civilization's survival. Then, suddenly, they're in normal assignments where nothing they do has that level of significance. The psychological adjustment can be difficult. Support systems exist to help with this transition, though they're limited by security classification. Carriers can't seek normal counseling because they can't discuss what they did. Specialized military counselors with appropriate clearances are available, but many carriers don't want to admit they need help because they fear it might affect their careers or security clearances. So they carry the psychological weight long after they've passed the physical briefcase to their replacement. They cope, they adapt, they move on with their lives. But they never fully forget what it felt like to stand behind the president, handcuffed to the apocalypse, waiting for the call that they hoped would never come. March 28, 1979, 3 Mile Island Nuclear Power Plant, Pennsylvania. At 4 a.m., a series of mechanical failures and operator errors led to partial nuclear meltdown at 3 Mile Island Unit 2. By 7 a.m., radiation levels were rising. By 9 a.m., Pennsylvania Governor Richard Thornburg was being briefed on the possibility of catastrophic radiation release that might require evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people. By 11 a.m., President Jimmy Carter was receiving updates from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The situation was unclear. Plant operators didn't fully understand what was happening inside the reactor. Radiation measurements were conflicting. The potential for catastrophic failure was unknown. And at 11:30 a.m., Major Richard Brennan, carrying the nuclear football as he stood in the West Wing outside the Oval Office, received an urgent call from Strategic Air Command on the football's secure line. SAC reported that Soviet submarines off the American coast had increased activity. Soviet strategic aviation had conducted unusual flight patterns, and Soviet intelligence monitoring of American media was showing intense interest in the 3 Mile Island incident. SAC wanted to know if the president needed to consider increased alert status given the domestic crisis and Soviet behavior. The call revealed something that most Americans didn't understand about the nuclear football. It wasn't just for authorizing retaliation after attack. It was also for managing the constant low-level nuclear tensions with the Soviet Union during any American crisis that might be misinterpreted or exploited. The Soviets, watching American media reports of potential nuclear catastrophe in Pennsylvania, were apparently considering whether the accident might create opportunities for intelligence collection or whether it might indicate broader American technical problems that could affect nuclear weapons systems. Their submarine and aviation activity suggested reconnaissance and readiness enhancement, not immediate threat. But it required American awareness and response. President Carter, dealing with the 3 Mile Island crisis, now also had to consider Soviet behavior. If he ordered evacuation of Pennsylvania communities, would the Soviets interpret that as sign of American weakness or distraction? If radiation release occurred, would Soviet intelligence attempt to exploit the chaos for collection operations against American nuclear sites? And if Soviet forces continued unusual activities, did American nuclear forces need to increase their readiness despite the domestic crisis? Major Brennan stood outside the Oval Office with the football, knowing that the briefcase handcuffed to his wrist might be needed not for nuclear war, but for calibrated show of American nuclear readiness designed to deter Soviet opportunism during domestic disaster. Carter's decision was measured. He ordered Navy to monitor Soviet submarine activity more closely, but not to increase general alert status. He authorized increased reconnaissance of Soviet strategic forces, but not changes to American nuclear posture that Soviets might interpret as escalatory. And he focused on the 3 Mile Island crisis itself, refusing to be distracted by Soviet behavior that was concerning but not immediately threatening. The 3 Mile Island crisis gradually resolved over the following days. Operators gained control of the reactor. Radiation release was limited, catastrophic meltdown was avoided, and Soviet forces returned to normal activity patterns once it became clear that American nuclear capability wasn't affected by the civilian reactor accident. But the incident revealed another dimension of the football's purpose. It was tool for nuclear signaling during crises that weren't themselves nuclear. Major Brennan hadn't needed to facilitate nuclear launch. He'd needed to maintain communication links between the president and nuclear forces so that Carter could monitor Soviet behavior and adjust American nuclear posture if necessary while dealing with domestic emergency. The football's communication equipment allowed the president to receive real-time updates about Soviet nuclear forces during the 3 Mile Island crisis. That information helped Carter make decisions about how to respond to the reactor accident without inadvertently creating nuclear crisis through mismanaged domestic emergency. Years later, after Cold War declassifications, it became clear that Soviet intelligence had been intensely interested in 3 Mile Island. They'd ordered submarines to move closer to American coast for signals intelligence collection. They'd increased reconnaissance flights to monitor American military responses, and they'd prepared analytical reports about whether civilian nuclear accident suggested vulnerabilities in American military nuclear systems. The Soviets hadn't been preparing for attack, but they had been probing to understand American vulnerabilities and to collect intelligence about nuclear command procedures during crisis. The football's constant availability to President Carter had allowed him to manage both the accident and the Soviet reaction simultaneously. This was the football's routine but critical role during the Cold War, not launching nuclear weapons, but maintaining presidential connection to nuclear forces during the constant small crises and tensions that required careful management to prevent escalation. The briefcase was used hundreds of times not for apocalypse, but for calibration, small adjustments to nuclear force posture designed to signal resolve or restraint depending on circumstances. Major Brennan described his experience during 3 Mile Island in a 2005 interview. "People think the football is only for nuclear war, but we used it constantly for nuclear signaling. The president needed to know what Soviet forces were doing. He needed to communicate with SAC about readiness postures. He needed to make decisions about whether American nuclear forces should respond to Soviet movements. That's what the football was actually for most of the time, not ending the world, but preventing misunderstandings that might lead toward ending the world." The 3 Mile Island incident was one of dozens of times during the Cold War when the football was actively used for nuclear command purposes short of actual weapons launch. Most of these incidents never became public. They were routine crisis management, unremarkable except to the people directly involved. But each incident demonstrated that the football wasn't just a symbol or a last resort. It was a working tool of presidential power, used regularly to maintain nuclear stability through constant small adjustments and communications. The apocalyptic scenarios got the attention, but the everyday crisis management was what actually kept nuclear peace. For every Dallas assassination or September 11th attack, there are hundreds of days when carrying the nuclear football is simply boring. Stand in hallways, sit in waiting rooms, watch the president give speeches, attend meetings where nuclear weapons are never mentioned, travel to events where the football's presence is purely precautionary. The aides describe it as 99% boredom, 1% terror. The terror is theoretical, the possibility that this might be the day when the football is actually needed. The boredom is real and constant, and managing that boredom while maintaining constant vigilance is one of the job's hardest aspects. Aides develop strategies for staying alert during endless hours of standing. Mental exercises, physical fidgeting, regular equipment checks, and the superstitious rituals that give structure to waiting. They count presidential speeches, miles traveled, days since last alert drill, anything to mark time and maintain focus. And they know that the routine could be shattered at any second. The president could turn and say, "I need the football." An aide could receive call from Strategic Air Command reporting attack. The world could change in an instant, and the person carrying the briefcase would need to transition from bored standby to crisis management without hesitation. That's the real skill being tested, not the ability to perform during obvious crisis, but the ability to remain ready during the endless stretches when nothing happens, to maintain focus through hours of tedium, to remember that the boring day could become the terrible day without warning. Most football carriers complete their tours without ever facing crisis. They stand through hundreds of speeches, travel thousands of miles, carry the briefcase through countless routine days, and then they rotate to new assignments, their service notable primarily for nothing having happened. But they know they were ready. They know that if the terrible day had come during their watch, they would have been there with the briefcase, with the codes, with the training. That knowledge makes the boring days meaningful even when they remain boring. October 1985. Beijing, China. President Ronald Reagan's state visit. The motorcade moved through Beijing's streets toward the Great Hall of the People for meetings with Chinese leadership. Major Thomas "Skip" Crosby followed in the presidential vehicle, the nuclear football in the seat beside him. Chinese security forces lined the route, maintaining crowd control and monitoring the American delegation. At one intersection, a Chinese security officer stepped forward and blocked the follow car carrying Crosby and the football. Through an interpreter, the officer explained that only the presidential limousine was authorized to proceed to the Great Hall. Support vehicles would be directed to a different entrance. Crosby explained through his interpreter that he carried classified communication equipment that had to remain with the president. The Chinese officer was unmoved. Security protocols required all support vehicles to use designated entrances. No exceptions. Crosby found himself in absurd standoff. He couldn't explain what the football was without violating security protocols, but he couldn't allow separation from the president. And the Chinese security officer, following his orders, wasn't going to let an unscheduled vehicle approach the Great Hall just because an American major insisted it was important. The standoff lasted 5 minutes before American Secret Service agents intervened, radioing ahead to halt the presidential motorcade until the football could catch up. Chinese security finally allowed Crosby's vehicle to proceed, though it was clear they were unhappy about deviating from their security plan for unexplained reasons. The Beijing incident was minor compared to what happened in Moscow in 1988. May 1988, Moscow, Soviet Union, Reagan's summit with Mikhail Gorbachev. The football had never been to Moscow. The Soviet Union was the primary target of the nuclear weapons it could authorize launching. Bringing the capability to order nuclear strike on Moscow to Moscow itself created bizarre security and diplomatic situation. Soviet intelligence obviously knew about the football's existence. They had collected information about it through various means over the years, but they had never had opportunity to observe it directly. Reagan's Moscow visit changed that. Soviet intelligence photographed Major James Keane carrying the football everywhere Reagan went in Moscow. They noted the briefcase's size, weight, how it was carried, and the security procedures surrounding it, and they attempted electronic surveillance of the briefcase's communication equipment, trying to map its radio frequencies and encryption methods. American security personnel had anticipated this. The football taken to Moscow had been specially modified. Decoy transmission systems that broadcast encrypted noise on various frequencies to confuse surveillance. Physical shielding to prevent electronic interrogation of the briefcase's contents, and procedures requiring that any communication from Moscow would use backup systems rather than the football's primary equipment, ensuring that Soviet surveillance couldn't map the actual command network. But the real challenge in Moscow wasn't technical security. It was political awkwardness. Reagan was in the Soviet capital to improve relations, to reduce nuclear tensions, to move toward arms reduction treaties. And everywhere he went, he was followed by a military officer carrying the briefcase full of plans for destroying the city where those peace negotiations were occurring. Soviet officials were polite enough not to mention it publicly. But in private conversations, some Soviet negotiators expressed dark humor about the situation. The American president bringing his nuclear launch codes to Moscow was like bringing a gun to a wedding. Everyone knew it was there, but acknowledging it would be gauche. Gorbachev himself reportedly joked with Reagan at one point during the summit, gesturing toward Major Keane. "I assume your officer isn't planning to use that briefcase while you're here?" Reagan responded, "Only if you make me angry." Both leaders laughed, but the exchange highlighted the surreal nature of carrying nuclear command authority into the capital of the primary target nation. The Moscow visit established precedent for future presidential trips to nuclear-armed nations. The football went everywhere the president went, regardless of diplomatic awkwardness. Nuclear command continuity took precedence over comfort or appearances. This policy would be tested again in later years. President Clinton taking the football to Beijing, President Obama taking it to Moscow, President Trump taking it to North Korea for the unprecedented summit with Kim Jong-un. Each trip created similar situations. Host nation security uncomfortable with unidentified military officer carrying classified equipment, American security personnel insisting on protocols that seemed paranoid in peaceful summit context, and the underlying reality that nuclear deterrence continued even during negotiations designed to reduce nuclear tensions. The most dramatic international incident involving the football occurred in 1994 during President Clinton's visit to Budapest, Hungary, for a summit meeting. November 1994. Budapest, Hungary. During a photo opportunity at the Danube River, a group of protesters broke through security barriers and rushed toward Clinton. Secret Service agents surrounded the president and began rapid evacuation. In the confusion, Major Bruce Holden, carrying the football, was knocked down by protesters and briefly separated from the presidential protective detail. For approximately 30 seconds, the nuclear football was on the ground in Budapest, surrounded by protesters, while the president was being evacuated in a different direction. Hungarian security forces helped Holden recover the briefcase and fight through the crowd to reach the president's vehicle. But those 30 seconds represented another moment when the physical security of nuclear command depended on a military officer's ability to protect a briefcase during chaotic attack. Investigation after the Budapest incident led to revised procedures for international travel. The military aide would be integrated more closely into Secret Service protective formations. Backup authentication methods would be available if the football was lost or compromised during international incidents. And in extreme situations, nuclear command could be temporarily transferred to the vice president back in Washington if the football's security was compromised during overseas travel. But these procedures were workarounds for a fundamental problem. The football was designed for use in Washington or aboard Air Force One, not for navigating complex international security situations where American authority might be challenged, or where local security forces might not understand why a briefcase needed special protection. Every international trip was a test of whether the football's security could be maintained in unfamiliar environments. So far, the system had held, but each incident revealed that holding it required constant improvisation and that security depended as much on luck as on planning. The nuclear football represents American military dominance and presidential authority. But traveling internationally, it becomes vulnerable in ways it never is on American soil. The president is surrounded by foreign security forces, constrained by diplomatic protocol, and operating in environments where American control is limited. This creates paradox. The moments when the president most needs secure nuclear command, during international crises, during meetings with adversaries, during trips to unstable regions, are precisely the moments when the football is most vulnerable to compromise, capture, or forced separation from presidential authority. The military has developed elaborate procedures for protecting the football during international travel. But procedures can't eliminate the fundamental vulnerability of carrying nuclear command authority into foreign territory where American power is limited and where adversaries might specifically target the football as intelligence prize or to create crisis. The alternative, leaving the football in Washington when the president travels internationally and relying on communication links back to American soil, would create different vulnerabilities, communication failures, time delays, and ambiguity about who has nuclear authority when the president is overseas and may be out of contact during crisis. So the football travels everywhere, and each trip is calculated risk. The risk is accepted because the alternative risks are judged worse, but accepting the risk doesn't eliminate it. And every international incident involving the football is a reminder that even the most powerful command system has moments of vulnerability when it depends on individuals protecting a briefcase in chaotic foreign environments. September 11th, 2001, 10:03 a.m. Eastern Time, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, PEOC, beneath the White House. Vice President Dick Cheney sat in the secure bunker, monitoring reports of additional hijacked aircraft still airborne. Secret Service had physically carried him from his office to the PEOC when the Pentagon was struck. In the chaos, Cheney had been separated from Lieutenant Commander Anthony Barnes, who carried the backup nuclear football. Barnes arrived at the PEOC entrance minutes later, out of breath, the football handcuffed to his wrist. But the security situation had become incredibly complex. The White House had been fully evacuated based on reports that a hijacked aircraft might be heading for Washington. Secret Service agents had scattered staff across secure locations. And continuity of government protocols were being activated for the first time since the Cold War. Cheney was in the PEOC with the backup football. President Bush was on Air Force One with the primary football, but under continuity of government plans, dozens of other officials were being evacuated to secure locations in case both President and Vice President were killed. Among those officials, Speaker of the House Dennis Hastert, who was third in line for the presidency, Senate President pro tempore Robert Byrd, fourth in line, and a succession of cabinet members who might need to assume the presidency if the top tier of leadership was eliminated by additional attacks. None of these officials had nuclear footballs assigned to them. The system had only two, presidential and vice presidential. If both Bush and Cheney were killed, nuclear authority would pass to the next person in the line of succession. But that person would have no football, no authentication codes, and no immediate way to exercise nuclear command. The problem had been identified in continuity of government planning for years, but never fully solved. How do you maintain nuclear command continuity when the presidential succession extends through officials who aren't normally in the nuclear chain of command and who aren't equipped with authentication systems? The theoretical solution existed. Emergency authentication procedures stored at Strategic Air Command headquarters could be activated if the president and vice president were both killed. SAC would contact the senior surviving official in the line of succession and establish temporary command authority using backup authentication systems. But the procedures had never been tested in reality, only in exercises. On September 11th, those procedures came close to being activated. At 10:10 a.m., reports indicated another hijacked aircraft was heading for Washington. Secret Service believed the target might be the White House or the Capitol. Cheney, in the PEOC, authorized shoot-down of any aircraft that approached the Capitol. But there was confusion about whether Cheney had authority to give that order or whether it required presidential approval. Air Force pilots intercepting United Flight 93, which had been hijacked and was indeed heading toward Washington, were confused about their rules of engagement. Shoot-down authorization existed, but did it apply to civilian aircraft? Who had given the authorization? Was it legitimate? In this confusion, United Flight 93 crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought the hijackers, eliminating the immediate threat. But the command confusion during those critical minutes revealed how quickly the chain of authority could become unclear during catastrophic attack. If Flight 93 had reached Washington and if it had successfully struck either the White House, potentially killing Cheney in the PEOC, or Air Force One, potentially killing Bush, the line of presidential succession would have shifted to Speaker Hastert. Hastert would have needed to exercise nuclear authority, but would have had no football, no codes, and no trained familiarity with nuclear command procedures. In that scenario, Strategic Air Command would have needed to establish communication with Hastert using emergency procedures, authenticate his identity through backup systems, and brief him on nuclear options during ongoing national crisis. The time required for all of this was unknown because it had never actually been done. Major Scott Crosby, carrying the primary football aboard Air Force One with President Bush, later described the confusion. "We were trying to establish secure communication with Strategic Air Command while Air Force One was flying evasive patterns at maximum altitude. The communication systems weren't designed for that kind of operational environment." Meanwhile, we were getting fragmentary reports about what was happening in Washington. At one point, someone suggested that both the president and vice president should go to separate secure locations to ensure continuity of government. But that would have meant splitting nuclear authority between two locations during active attack. Nobody wanted to make that decision. The crisis resolved without the worst-case scenarios occurring. Bush and Cheney both survived. Nuclear authority remained clear. But September 11th had revealed that continuity of government planning for nuclear command had serious gaps. No footballs for officials beyond the vice president, no training for successors outside the normal chain, no tested procedures for rapid establishment of nuclear authority with backup systems. Pentagon planners spent the following months developing improved procedures. Additional backup footballs that could be rapidly deployed to senior officials if needed. Pre-positioned authentication systems at secure evacuation sites where government leaders might shelter during attack. And training for cabinet members and congressional leaders who might need to exercise nuclear authority in catastrophic scenarios. But the improvements still depended on assumptions about communication, time, and the ability to establish command authority during chaos. If decapitation attack eliminated the top tier of leadership simultaneously, The system would require hours to re-establish functional nuclear command, hours that might not be available if the attack was prelude to follow-on nuclear strike. The September 11th experience also revealed another uncomfortable reality. Modern terrorism could potentially achieve strategic effects similar to nuclear attack without using nuclear weapons. Killing the president and vice president simultaneously wouldn't require ICBMs. It could be achieved with hijacked aircraft, truck bombs, or coordinated assaults on multiple locations where leadership was present. This meant that nuclear command continuity planning needed to account for conventional attacks that could create nuclear command crises. The football and its supporting systems had been designed for nuclear war scenarios, but they needed to function during any catastrophic attack that might eliminate presidential leadership, regardless of what weapons the attackers used. The modifications made after September 11th improved the system's resilience, but they couldn't eliminate the fundamental vulnerability. Nuclear command depended on presidential continuity, and presidential continuity could potentially be disrupted by determined adversaries using various attack methods. No amount of planning could guarantee that nuclear authority would transfer smoothly during actual catastrophic decapitation attempt. After September 11th, Pentagon planners began seriously gaming scenarios that had previously been considered too unlikely to warrant detailed planning. Simultaneous assassination of president and vice president, destruction of Washington while both leaders were present, loss of all primary and backup nuclear command facilities in coordinated attack, scenarios where the line of succession extended to officials who had never been briefed on nuclear procedures and who had no authentication equipment. The gaming revealed disturbing conclusions. In truly catastrophic scenarios, nuclear command authority might be unclear for hours or even days. Multiple officials might claim authority. Strategic commanders might receive conflicting orders. Adversaries might exploit the confusion to launch attacks, knowing American retaliation would be delayed or paralyzed by command chaos. The solution to these scenarios couldn't be purely technical or procedural. It required cultural change. Nuclear commanders needed to be trained to exercise judgment about which orders were legitimate when authentication systems were compromised. Backup officials needed training on nuclear command, even if they were unlikely to ever need it. And redundancy needed to be built at every level, even though redundancy created its own vulnerabilities. The post-September 11th improvements made the system more robust against catastrophic attacks. But they also made it more complex, with more people having potential nuclear authority, more authentication systems distributed across more locations, and more opportunities for confusion about who had legitimate command during crisis. The trade-off was judged necessary. Better to have complex system with multiple backups than simple system that could be eliminated by single attack. But complexity brought its own dangers, and September 11th had shown that even well-planned systems could struggle when reality exceeded planners' worst-case assumptions. August 9, 1974. The White House. Richard Nixon resigned the presidency at noon. Gerald Ford took the oath of office. Nuclear authority transferred from Nixon to Ford. The military aide carrying the football moved from following Nixon to following Ford. The system functioned as designed, except for one detail that wouldn't be discovered for 3 days. Nixon kept his authentication codes. When Nixon departed the White House on Marine One after Ford's swearing in, he still had his biscuit, the laminated card containing his personal authentication codes, in his pocket. In the chaos of resignation and transition, no one had thought to retrieve it. Nixon flew to California as private citizen, carrying the capability to authenticate himself as president to nuclear forces. The codes were supposed to become invalid the instant Ford took the oath. Authentication systems were designed to recognize only the current president's codes, but the physical card Nixon carried still had the codes printed on it. And for 3 days, until the oversight was discovered, a former president had authentication codes in his possession. The incident was discovered when military aides conducting routine inventory realized they had never received Nixon's codes during the transition. Frantic calls to California confirmed that Nixon still had the card. Secret Service agents retrieved it from Nixon's San Clemente residence and returned it to Washington for destruction. Investigation determined that the codes had been deactivated when Ford took office, so Nixon couldn't have used them even if he'd tried. But the incident revealed sloppy transition procedures and raised uncomfortable questions. What if Nixon had refused to return the codes? What if he'd claimed he was still legitimate president? What legal authority existed to forcibly retrieve authentication codes from a former president who wouldn't cooperate? The Nixon incident wasn't the only time authentication codes remained with someone who shouldn't have them. Investigation triggered by Nixon's retained codes uncovered other cases. Lyndon Johnson had kept his codes for 2 weeks after leaving office in January 1969. The cards had been in a desk drawer in his Texas ranch, forgotten during transition chaos. They were discovered when military aides finally conducted complete inventory and realized Johnson had never returned his authentication materials. Vice President Spiro Agnew, who resigned in October 1973 before Nixon's resignation, had apparently kept his vice presidential authentication codes. They were never recovered. Agnew's resignation occurred during legal crisis, and in the chaos, no one had thought to retrieve nuclear authentication materials from the disgraced vice president. The revelation that multiple former officials had retained authentication codes prompted emergency review of all nuclear command security procedures. New protocols required that authentication codes be retrieved from outgoing officials before they left the White House, not afterward. Security personnel would physically confirm possession of the codes during transition ceremonies. But the incidents raised deeper question about authentication security. The entire nuclear command system depended on small laminated cards that could be forgotten, lost, or retained by people who shouldn't have them. If tight control over physical cards was proving difficult, how secure was the authentication system really? Pentagon security analysts struggled with this question for months. The alternatives to physical cards all had problems. Memorized codes could be forgotten or revealed under duress. Biometric systems could fail during stress conditions or could be spoofed. Electronic authentication devices could be hacked or could malfunction. The simple laminated card, despite its vulnerabilities, remained the most reliable option. But the retained codes incidents led to important change. Codes would be changed more frequently, reducing the window during which old codes could potentially be misused. New procedures required confirmation that old codes had been retrieved before new codes were activated, and strict inventory controls tracked every authentication card from creation through destruction. The changes made it less likely that authentication codes would be retained by people who shouldn't have them. But they couldn't eliminate the fundamental vulnerability. The system depended on physical objects small enough to fit in a pocket, which meant they were small enough to be lost, stolen, or forgotten about. Years later, during Clinton administration, this vulnerability would be tested again when Clinton's codes went missing and no one could determine when they'd been lost or where they might be. The pattern repeated. Physical authentication systems proved difficult to secure not because of sophisticated attacks, but because of mundane human failures like forgetting to return a card or not noticing it was missing. The history of nuclear football security is not a story of sophisticated attacks defeated by clever countermeasures. It's a story of mundane failures, cards forgotten in jacket pockets, briefcases separated from presidents during chaotic evacuations, codes left in bedrooms or put through washing machines. The Pentagon invests billions in secure communication systems, encrypted networks, hardened command centers, and sophisticated authentication protocols. But those investments can be undermined by a president forgetting to carry a laminated card or by a former president keeping authentication codes because no one remembered to ask for them back during resignation chaos. This reflects deeper truth about security. Technical sophistication doesn't guarantee security if human factors aren't managed. The most secure system in the world fails if users don't follow procedures, if transitions aren't managed carefully, or if mundane oversights create vulnerabilities. The nuclear football has survived sophisticated Soviet intelligence operations, terrorist attacks, and technological obsolescence. But it struggles with jacket pockets, hospital administrative chaos, and transition ceremonies where everyone is too distracted to remember to collect authentication cards. The lesson is humbling for organizations that pride themselves on technical sophistication. Your security is only as strong as your worst mundane failure. And mundane failures are the hardest to eliminate because they require constant human vigilance rather than technological solutions. January 2018. The White House residence, 3 a.m. President Donald Trump was awake, composing tweets on his personal smartphone about North Korea and nuclear capabilities. In the hallway outside his bedroom, Major Thomas Graves stood with the nuclear football, maintaining the 24-hour watch that military aides had kept since Eisenhower's presidency. Trump's tweet appeared at 3:17 a.m. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un just stated that the nuclear button is on his desk at all times. Will someone from his depleted and food-starved regime please inform him that I, too, have a nuclear button, but it is a much bigger and more powerful one than his, and my button works. The tweet went viral instantly. News media analyzed it. Foreign governments responded, arms control experts expressed alarm, and Major Graves, standing outside the president's bedroom with the actual system for launching nuclear weapons, was asked by reporters later that day whether Trump's nuclear button tweet accurately described how nuclear command worked. Graves couldn't answer directly. Discussing nuclear command procedures in detail was classified, but the tweet had created confusion that required clarification. The president didn't have a literal button that launched nuclear weapons. The system was far more complex, requiring the football, authentication codes, communication with Strategic Air Command, and execution of launch orders by multiple personnel. The nuclear button was metaphor, not literal description. But Trump's tweet had made millions of people worldwide think the president had a physical button on his desk that could start nuclear war instantly. The confusion created by the tweet was exactly the kind of misunderstanding that nuclear command secrecy had been designed to prevent. The Trump presidency revealed new challenges for nuclear command in the digital age. A president who communicated directly with the public via social media, often without consulting advisors. A president whose statements about nuclear weapons were sometimes inaccurate or misleading. And a president whose volatile rhetoric raised questions about whether nuclear command procedures provided adequate safeguards against impulsive decisions. The constitutional reality was clear. The president had sole authority to order nuclear launch. No one else in the government could override that decision or prevent it. The nuclear football and its procedures existed to ensure the president could exercise that authority quickly during crisis, not to constrain presidential decisions about when to use nuclear weapons. But Trump's tweets about nuclear weapons forced public discussion of questions that had been debated privately for decades. Should there be checks on presidential nuclear authority? Should anyone be able to stop a president from ordering nuclear launch if that order seemed impulsive or based on poor judgment? Should the system that gave presidents complete nuclear control be reformed to require consultation or confirmation? Senator Ed Markey and Representative Ted Lieu introduced legislation in 2017 that would prevent the president from launching nuclear first strike without congressional authorization. The legislation specifically prohibited nuclear launch except in response to nuclear attack on the United States or its allies, unless Congress declared war or explicitly authorized nuclear use. The legislation had no chance of passage. It faced opposition from military leadership, who argued that constraining presidential nuclear authority would undermine deterrence, and from constitutional scholars who questioned whether Congress could legislate restrictions on the president's commander-in-chief powers. But the legislation represented growing concern that nuclear command procedures designed for rapid response had insufficient safeguards against presidential decisions that might be rash rather than rational. The debate intensified after Trump's June 2018 summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Singapore. Trump claimed after the meeting that North Korea was no longer a nuclear threat, despite no concrete agreements on denuclearization. Arms control experts noted that Trump's statements were inconsistent with intelligence assessments and suggested the president might be making nuclear security judgments based on personal impressions rather than analytical rigor. These concerns raised fundamental question. What happens if a president orders nuclear launch based on false information, personal grievance, or impulsive decision during non-crisis situation? The system would execute the order. Launch commanders were trained to authenticate and execute valid presidential orders, not to second-guess the president's judgment. Some retired military officers suggested that launch commanders would refuse illegal orders, such as orders to conduct nuclear first strike, that violated international law or constitutional requirements for congressional authorization of war. But current military leadership emphasized that launch commanders' duty was to execute authenticated presidential orders, not to make independent judgments about their legality or wisdom. The tension between civilian control of military and concerns about unchecked presidential power over nuclear weapons was not new. It dated to the beginning of the nuclear age, but Trump's presidency brought it into public consciousness in ways previous presidents hadn't. General John Hyten, head of Strategic Command during part of Trump's presidency, testified to Congress in November 2017 about nuclear command procedures. Senator Durbin asked directly, "Can you envision a scenario where you would refuse to carry out a presidential order for a nuclear launch?" Hyten's response was carefully worded. "I provide advice to the president. He will tell me what to do, and if it's illegal, guess what's going to happen? I'm going to say, 'Mr. President, that's illegal.' And guess what he's going to do? He's going to say, 'What would be legal?' And we'll come up with options, with a mix of capabilities to respond to whatever the situation is, and that's the way it works. It's not that complicated." But the answer raised more questions than it resolved. Who determines whether a nuclear launch order is illegal? What constitutes an illegal order in context of nuclear weapons where international law is ambiguous? How long would this discussion between president and military commander take when the supposed time pressure for nuclear decision is measured in minutes? The football continued functioning through Trump's presidency as it had through previous administrations. Military aides carried it. Trump had his authentication codes. Communication systems connected the president to Strategic Air Command. The technical system worked. But Trump's public statements about nuclear weapons, his unpredictable communication style, and his willingness to make unprecedented decisions without consulting traditional advisors created new uncertainty about how the system would function if Trump ever actually needed to use it. The digital age had brought transparency and immediate communication that changed how presidents interacted with the public. Trump's tweets reached millions instantly, without staff review or strategic communication planning. That immediacy was often celebrated as authentic leadership. But when applied to nuclear weapons, immediacy and impulsiveness seemed dangerous rather than authentic. The football had been designed for presidents who were thoughtful, consultative, and constrained by institutional norms. It had always given presidents complete authority, but previous presidents had exercised that authority within framework of careful deliberation. Trump's presidency raised the question of what happened when presidential style didn't match the assumptions built into nuclear command procedures. The answer, discovered during Trump's term, was nothing happened differently. The procedures continued working as designed. The president had complete authority. The military executed lawful orders. The system gave presidents exactly the power it was designed to give them, regardless of how they chose to exercise that power. Whether that was reassuring or terrifying depended on your assessment of presidential judgment. And that assessment was exactly what nuclear command procedures had been designed to avoid requiring. The system worked the same for cautious presidents and impulsive presidents, for those who consulted widely and those who decided alone. The football was neutral. It gave power without judging how that power would be used. That neutrality was both its greatest strength and its most concerning characteristic. Presidential nuclear authority is absolute in a way that few other powers are. The president can't declare war without Congress, can't pass laws without Congress, can't override Supreme Court decisions, but the president can order nuclear launch, and no one can stop it. This absolute authority exists for operational reasons. Nuclear deterrence requires the credible threat of rapid retaliation. Rapid retaliation requires presidential ability to order launch without delays for consultation or confirmation. Therefore, the system removes all checks that might slow presidential decision. But absolute authority means the system works identically regardless of presidential judgment, temperament, or decision-making process. It works for presidents who agonize over decisions and presidents who decide impulsively. For presidents who consult widely and presidents who trust only themselves. For presidents in their best moments and presidents in their worst. This creates unsettling reality. The most destructive power ever created is controlled by a system that imposes no constraints on how that power is exercised. The football gives presidents the capability to end civilization, and the only check on that capability is the president's own judgment about when and whether to use it. Some argue this is appropriate. The president is elected to make these decisions, is briefed on nuclear matters, and should have complete authority in crisis. Others argue it's dangerous. No individual should have unconstrained power over weapons that could end human civilization, regardless of that individual's position or election. The debate is unresolved and probably unresolvable, but it's brought into focus whenever a president's judgment is questioned, as it was during Trump's term and during other administrations when presidents seemed potentially impulsive or erratic. The football doesn't care about these debates. It works the same either way, giving presidents exactly the power that nuclear strategy requires, trusting that the person carrying that power will exercise it wisely. That trust has held so far. Whether it will continue to hold is the question that defines nuclear age anxiety. 2022. Classified briefing, Pentagon. Defense Department officials presented new threat assessments for nuclear command and control systems. The briefing focused on emerging threats that previous generations of the football had never faced. Artificial intelligence that might be used to spoof authentication systems. Quantum computing that could potentially break encryption protecting nuclear communications. Deepfake technology that could create false video or audio of the president ordering nuclear launch. And coordinated cyber attacks that might compromise multiple systems simultaneously. The briefing's conclusion was sobering. The football's security, which had relied on physical custody and analog authentication systems, was increasingly vulnerable to digital threats that didn't require physical access to the briefcase. Adversaries might not need to capture the football, they might be able to compromise it remotely. Through cyber means that the system wasn't designed to defend against. The specific threats outlined were technically sophisticated but operationally plausible. AI-powered social engineering attacks could potentially manipulate personnel with access to nuclear command systems into revealing authentication protocols or creating vulnerabilities. The attacks would use machine learning to identify personnel weaknesses and craft personalized manipulation campaigns. Quantum computers, if developed by adversaries before American defenses were updated, could potentially decrypt nuclear command communications that current encryption methods protected. This wouldn't allow adversaries to order nuclear launch, but it would allow them to understand American nuclear command procedures and potentially develop attacks against those procedures. Deepfake technology could create false video of the president ordering nuclear launch, potentially causing confusion about whether orders were legitimate. While authentication codes would still be required, the deepfake could create critical seconds of uncertainty during crisis when seconds might matter. Coordinated cyber attacks could target multiple nodes in the nuclear command network simultaneously. The football's communication systems, strategic air command's reception systems, and backup command facilities. The attacks wouldn't need to succeed at all locations. Creating confusion at any critical node might be sufficient to delay or prevent nuclear retaliation during enemy first strike. The most concerning scenario combined multiple threats. Cyber attack disables the football's primary communication systems. Deepfake video appears to show the president ordering nuclear launch via backup channels. Confusion about whether the order is legitimate delays authentication, while adversary launches first strike that destroys American nuclear forces before retaliation can be executed. The scenario was theoretical, but not implausible, and it revealed that the football, despite decades of upgrades and security improvements, might be vulnerable to 21st century threats in ways that 20th century defenses couldn't address. The Defense Department's response was multi-layered. Implement quantum-resistant encryption for all nuclear command communications. The new encryption methods would remain secure even against quantum computers, though implementation would require years. Develop AI-powered authentication systems that could detect deep fakes and other spoofing attempts. The systems would analyze multiple characteristics of communications to verify authenticity beyond just authentication codes. Create resilient backup systems that could function independently if primary systems were compromised. The backups would use different technologies and protocols, making coordinated attack against all systems more difficult. Enhance human judgment elements in nuclear command. Operators would be trained to question orders that seemed inconsistent with situation awareness, even if authentication appeared valid. The goal was to create human firebreak against automated or AI-driven attacks that might bypass technical security. But these solutions created new problems. Quantum-resistant encryption was computationally intensive and might not work reliably on portable systems like the football. AI authentication systems might generate false positives, delaying legitimate orders during actual crisis. Resilient backups added complexity that could create confusion about which system was authoritative, and enhanced human judgment introduced delays that might prevent rapid retaliation that nuclear deterrence depended on. The familiar pattern emerged. Every solution to new threats created new vulnerabilities or degraded capabilities that had been important for other reasons. The football existed at intersection of multiple competing requirements: security, speed, reliability, presidential authority, survivability, and optimizing any one requirement compromised others. In 2023, Pentagon officials faced additional concern. Generative AI and large language models might be able to analyze publicly available information about nuclear command procedures and generate sophisticated attacks based on that analysis. While specific football protocols remained classified, enough information existed in public domain from congressional testimony, academic analyses, memoirs of former officials, that AI systems could potentially construct detailed models of how nuclear command worked and identify vulnerabilities. This led to troubling realization. Nuclear command security had traditionally depended partly on obscurity. Adversaries didn't know exactly how the system worked, which made attacks difficult to plan. But AI analysis of public information might eliminate that obscurity, allowing adversaries to understand the system well enough to develop effective attacks without ever accessing classified information. The solution to this problem was unclear. The Pentagon couldn't retroactively classify public information. They couldn't prevent AI systems from analyzing open-source material. And they couldn't redesign nuclear command procedures fast enough to stay ahead of AI-driven threat analysis. What they could do was assume that adversaries understood the system as well as unclassified information allowed and design security measures accordingly. This meant additional redundancy, more human verification, and acceptance that the football would need to function in an environment where adversaries had sophisticated understanding of its capabilities and limitations. By 2024, the nuclear football had evolved far beyond Eisenhower's simple briefcase. It contained multiple communication systems using different technologies. It had both digital and analog authentication methods. It connected to hardened command networks through encrypted links. And it was defended by security measures that addressed everything from physical theft to quantum computing attacks. But every evolution made the system more complex. And complexity created its own vulnerabilities. More things that could fail. More training required for users, more potential for confusion during crisis, more opportunities for human error in systems that depended on perfect execution during the worst moments in history. The future threats briefings made clear that the football would continue evolving, trying to stay ahead of technological threats that evolved faster than defense systems could be updated. Whether it would succeed was a question that couldn't be answered with certainty, only tested by actual crisis. And that test, if it ever came, would occur under worst possible conditions. During attack, with infrastructure failing, with time measured in minutes, and with the survival of civilization depending on system working perfectly, despite everything being designed to prevent it from working. The football's early history involved threats that changed slowly. Soviet capabilities improved gradually over decades. Physical security requirements remained relatively constant. Authentication methods could be updated at measured pace. Planners had time to identify vulnerabilities and develop solutions. The digital age accelerated everything. Cyber threats emerged and evolved within months. AI capabilities advanced faster than defense systems could be updated. New attack vectors appeared from unexpected directions, and the time available for defensive adaptation compressed from years to months or weeks. This acceleration created strategic disadvantage for defense. The football needed to work reliably for decades, but threats evolved on timescales of months. Updating nuclear command systems required extensive testing, training, and integration processes that took years. Adversaries could develop and deploy new attacks faster than defenders could respond. The military's strategy for managing this acceleration was to overinvest in redundancy and resilience, multiple systems using different technologies, making it difficult for adversaries to attack all of them simultaneously. Human judgment at multiple points, creating fire breaks against automated attacks, and continuous monitoring for new threats, allowing rapid response even if prevention wasn't possible. But the strategy couldn't eliminate the fundamental challenge. The football needed to work during crisis that might involve previously unknown attacks, using capabilities that hadn't existed when the system was last updated. Perfect defense was impossible. The goal was adequate defense, security sufficient to ensure the system would function well enough despite attacks, not perfectly. That good enough approach had worked throughout the Cold War. Whether it would continue working in the AI-powered, cyber-threat-laden future was the existential gamble at the heart of nuclear deterrence. 2019. Lieutenant Colonel Casey Johnson became the first woman to serve as a military aide carrying the nuclear football for President Trump. Her selection was historic not because gender had ever been officially barrier to the role, but because the extreme security clearances, psychological evaluations, and physical requirements had historically resulted in mostly male candidates. Johnson's path to carrying the football had been unconventional. She'd served as intelligence officer, completed advanced training in nuclear command procedures, and distinguished herself in previous White House military office assignments. When she was selected for the football duty, some media coverage focused on the historic gender milestone. Johnson preferred to focus on the professional requirements. Carrying the football isn't about gender. It's about being trusted with civilization's survival. The only question that matters is whether you can do the job. The job was exactly as demanding for Johnson as it had been for the male officers who preceded her. 24-hour availability, constant travel with the president, physical stamina to carry 50 pounds for hours, psychological resilience to live with constant awareness that the briefcase handcuffed to her wrist contained the capability to end human civilization, and perfect execution of procedures that had no margin for error. Johnson described her experience in a 2021 interview after rotating out of the duty. People asked me what it was like to be the first woman carrying the football. I told them it was like being the 50th or 100th or however many people had carried it before me. Boring most of the time. Terrifying occasionally, and always aware that if something went wrong, if the moment came when the president needed the football, my performance would matter more than anything else I'd ever done in my life. The historic significance of women serving in the role was real, but Johnson was correct that the fundamental experience was the same, regardless of gender: the weight of responsibility, the isolation of being unable to discuss the duty, the psychological burden of constant readiness for catastrophe, and the knowledge that success in the role was measured by nothing happening. The harder you worked, the less visible your contribution. What Johnson didn't mention in her public comments, but what became clear from discussions with other personnel who served during her time, was that she had faced the same crisis, simulations, and operational challenges that had tested every football carrier. Separation from the president during unexpected security evacuations, communication system failures that required improvisation, and moments when split-second decisions determined whether nuclear command continuity was maintained. Johnson's performance during these challenges was exactly what it needed to be: competent, calm, and focused on the mission rather than on the historic nature of her service. She did the job the way it was supposed to be done, and in doing so, she proved what should have been obvious but apparently needed demonstration. Carrying the football was about professional capability, not about gender. By 2024, multiple women had served in the role. The pioneering aspect had given way to routine. Women carried the football just as men did, rotating through the assignment based on qualifications and availability rather than making news for breaking gender barriers. This normalization was exactly what Johnson had said she wanted, for the role to be judged by the professional standards it required rather than by demographic characteristics of the people who filled it. The football was too important to be about anything except competence and reliability. Gender, race, age, background, none of it mattered compared to the fundamental question. Can you do the job when civilization depends on you doing it perfectly? The military had learned, later than it should have, that the answer to that question wasn't predicted by demographics. It was predicted by training, evaluation, psychological assessment, and proven performance under pressure. When selection focused on those factors, women proved as capable as men at carrying the weight that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with mental fortitude. The faces carrying the football have changed over decades, young and old, male and female, different races, backgrounds, and experiences, but the burden they carry hasn't changed. It's the same weight that Chester Clifton carried in Dallas in 1963. The responsibility for maintaining nuclear command continuity, regardless of circumstances. Technology has evolved. Procedures have been refined. Security has been enhanced. But the core duty remains identical. Stay close to the President. Protect the briefcase. Be ready to facilitate nuclear command if crisis occurs. And maintain perfect performance during routine conditions so that you'll be capable of perfect performance during catastrophe. That duty is gender-neutral, race-neutral, and generation-neutral. It demands the same things from everyone who assumes it: physical capability, mental fortitude, perfect reliability, and willingness to accept that success means nothing happens and you're invisible, while failure means everything ends and you're blamed. The diversification of who carries the football reflects broader military and societal changes, but it also reflects simpler truth. The job is difficult enough that limiting the candidate pool by anything except capability makes no sense. You need the best people available, regardless of what demographic categories they fit into. By 2024, that principle was finally being applied consistently. The result was exactly what it should have been: competent people doing the job regardless of their backgrounds. The football continued functioning, nuclear command continuity was maintained, and the burdens of the role were distributed across the widest possible pool of qualified candidates. The only thing that mattered was the question every carrier faced every day: if today is the day, will you be ready? March 2020. The White House during COVID-19 pandemic. The nuclear football faced unprecedented operational challenge. How do you maintain 24-hour proximity to the President when the President and everyone around him might be infected with highly contagious virus? Major William Rodriguez, serving as military aide to President Trump, found himself navigating protocols that had never been designed for pandemic conditions. Should he wear a mask while standing behind the President during televised speeches? How could he maintain physical distance requirements while staying close enough to hand the President the football if needed? What happened if he tested positive for COVID and needed to quarantine? The pandemic revealed that nuclear command procedures had assumed continuous presidential access under normal health conditions. They hadn't been designed for scenarios where infectious disease might force separation between president and football, or where the military aide might be quarantined, or where the entire White House might be experiencing outbreak that made normal proximity impossible. In October 2020, President Trump tested positive for COVID-19 and was hospitalized at Walter Reed Medical Center. The football went with him, carried by Major Rodriguez, who was tested daily to ensure he could continue performing his duties. But the hospitalization raised uncomfortable questions. If the president was seriously ill and potentially incapacitated by the virus, at what point did nuclear authority transfer to Vice President Pence? The 25th Amendment provided mechanisms for transfer of presidential powers during incapacity. But those mechanisms had never been used for infectious disease, and the president's condition fluctuated hourly, making clear determinations of capacity difficult. If Major Rodriguez tested positive while carrying the football, who would replace him? Normally, replacement military aides were available, but during pandemic, multiple aides were in quarantine at various times. There were moments when backup systems were stretched thin by infectious disease affecting personnel throughout the nuclear command chain. If major COVID outbreak occurred in Washington, potentially affecting both president and vice president simultaneously, what would happen to nuclear command authority? The continuity of government plans assumed attacks or accidents that might kill leaders, not infectious diseases that might incapacitate multiple people in the line of succession simultaneously. None of these worst-case scenarios occurred. Trump recovered. Nuclear command continuity was maintained, but the pandemic revealed that biological threats created command challenges different from the kinetic threats that nuclear procedures had been designed around. The pandemic also highlighted vulnerability in nuclear command that was obvious once pointed out, but hadn't been explicitly planned for. The entire system depended on human health. Presidents needed to be conscious and capable. Military aides needed to be physically able to carry equipment. Communication personnel needed to staff command centers. Any biological threat that incapacitated large numbers of people simultaneously could potentially degrade nuclear command capability not through direct attack on systems, but through indirect effect of removing human operators. Pentagon planners conducted post-pandemic reviews of nuclear command procedures. The recommendations included enhanced infectious disease protocols for personnel in nuclear command chain, including prioritization for vaccination and treatment during pandemics, procedures for maintaining nuclear command when physical proximity between president and football might need to be reduced due to infection control requirements, backup systems that could function if significant percentages of nuclear command personnel were simultaneously quarantined or ill. Clearer 25th Amendment procedures for temporary transfer of power during presidential illness that might affect capacity for nuclear decision-making. The recommendations were implemented in 2021 and 2022. But they represented yet another category of threat that the football needed to be resilient against. Not just kinetic attacks, not just cyber attacks, but biological threats that might degrade nuclear command through indirect effects on the humans operating the system. The lesson from COVID was humbling. Nuclear command had focused so intensely on technological threats and kinetic attacks that it had underestimated the vulnerability created by depending on human operators who might become sick, fatigued, or incapacitated by threats that had nothing to do with nuclear weapons. Infectious disease has always been potential threat to military operations, but nuclear command's dependence on rapid response and perfect reliability made it uniquely vulnerable to any disruption of personnel availability. The COVID pandemic demonstrated this vulnerability in relatively mild form. Some personnel quarantined, some procedures modified, some backup systems activated. But the nuclear command system continued functioning because the disease, while widespread, didn't simultaneously incapacitate all personnel in critical positions. The question raised by pandemic planners was more dire. What if a biological attack or pandemic specifically targeted the nuclear command chain? What if an adversary released engineered pathogen designed to incapacitate military personnel responsible for nuclear operations? The scenario wasn't far-fetched. Adversaries knew that degrading American nuclear command capability could create window for attack. Biological agents could potentially achieve that degradation more reliably than kinetic attacks on hardened facilities or cyber attacks on defended networks. The defense against this threat required combining biological security measures, vaccination, isolation protocols, geographic dispersion of personnel, with procedural resilience, backup personnel, degraded mode operations, rapid replacement systems. But perfect defense was impossible. Biological threats could potentially incapacitate large numbers of people faster than backup systems could replace them. The football, which had survived Dallas, Saigon, September 11th, and cyber threats, faced a category of vulnerability that was ancient but newly relevant. Human bodies were fragile, and systems depending on those bodies were vulnerable to anything that affected human health. The pandemic had provided warning. Whether the military would adequately prepare for future biological threats to nuclear command remained to be seen. The nuclear football's contents are classified. Officially, the Pentagon won't confirm specific details, but decades of interviews with former officials, congressional testimony, and occasional security lapses have revealed enough to construct reasonably accurate picture of what's inside the briefcase that could end civilization. The Black Book containing the single integrated operational plan. A document of several hundred pages listing every nuclear target and every attack option available to American forces. The options range from limited strikes on specific military targets to full counter-value attacks destroying enemy society. Each option includes estimated casualties, required forces, and execution procedures. The gold codes, or authentication cards, the President's personal biscuit, plus backup authentication materials. These verify presidential identity to Strategic Air Command and authorize weapons release. The codes change regularly and are unique to each president. Secure communication equipment, radio systems, satellite links, and backup communication devices that allow the president to reach Strategic Air Command, the Joint Chiefs, and other command authorities. The equipment includes both digital and analog systems for resilience against different types of attacks. A card listing secure locations where the president could be evacuated during attack, hardened command posts, underground facilities, and airborne command platforms. The list is updated regularly based on threat assessments and facility availability. Procedures for emergency alert system, instructions for activating nationwide emergency broadcasts if nuclear attack is imminent or underway. The procedures include authentication codes and broadcast protocols, continuity of government protocols, documents outlining presidential succession, backup command authorities, and procedures for maintaining government functionality after catastrophic attack. That's the official understanding based on unclassified sources. But former military aides who carried the football occasionally reveal additional details that official sources won't confirm. Colonel Buzz Patterson, who carried the football for President Clinton, described in his memoir that the briefcase also contained a list of underground command facilities with capacity ratings. How many people could be sheltered at each location? How long supplies would last? And which facilities were currently operational? Another former aide mentioned that the football included satellite phone numbers for foreign leaders, direct lines to British Prime Minister, French President, and other Allied heads of state who might need to be contacted during nuclear crisis. Several aides confirmed that the football contained no actual weapon codes or direct launch mechanisms. It had communication equipment and authentication materials, but the actual orders to launch nuclear weapons would be transmitted separately through Strategic Air Command channels after presidential authentication. One revealing detail came from an aide who served during the Reagan administration. The football included a card listing the estimated casualties for each attack option in the PSYOP. The numbers were staggering, minimum casualties in the hundreds of millions, even for the most limited strike options. The card existed to ensure that presidents understood the human cost of the decisions they were making, not just the strategic effects. The weight of the football, approximately 50 pounds after recent modernizations, comes not from any particularly heavy components, but from the cumulative weight of communication equipment, backup batteries, multiple books and documents, and redundant systems. It's heavy because it contains everything the president might need to command nuclear forces under any circumstances, with no single point of failure. What the football doesn't contain is equally revealing. It has no direct connection to nuclear weapons. It can't launch missiles by itself. The president can't open the briefcase and push a button that starts nuclear war. The football is purely a communication and authentication system. It allows the president to issue orders and prove those orders are legitimate. But the actual weapons launch requires multiple other people at multiple other locations to receive, authenticate, and execute those orders. This means the nuclear button metaphor is fundamentally misleading. There is no button. There is a briefcase full of communication equipment and authentication materials. There is a process involving multiple people and multiple verification steps. And there are launch codes that are separate from anything in the football, maintained by Strategic Air Command and changed regularly. The multi-step process exists for safety. No single point of failure, no accidental launch, no unauthorized use, but it creates tension with the requirement for rapid response. More verification steps mean more time required, which means less time available for retaliation after warning of attack. The balance between safety and speed is embedded in the football's contents. Enough authentication to prevent unauthorized use, but not so much that it delays legitimate orders. Enough redundancy to survive equipment failure, but not so much complexity that operators become confused during crisis. One detail that's never officially confirmed, but widely believed. The football contains handwritten notes from previous presidents to their successors. Each president supposedly adds a personal message after leaving office. Advice, warnings, reflections on the burden of nuclear command. These notes aren't policy documents. They're human acknowledgement from one person who carried the weight to another who will carry it next. The notes reportedly remain in the football, accumulating over decades, so that each new president who faces nuclear decision knows that others before them faced the same burden and found ways to bear it. Whether this tradition actually exists, and what those notes might say, remains classified. But the story persists among military aides who suggest that the most important thing in the football isn't the technology or the attack plans. It's the human wisdom accumulated from presidents who understood what it meant to hold the power to end civilization and chose not to use it. What's definitely inside the football is regularly updated, Technology refreshed, documents revised, procedures modified. What's never updated is the fundamental purpose. Give presidents the capability to command nuclear forces during crisis. Everything else, the specific equipment, the particular procedures, the exact contents, serves that purpose. And the purpose, unchanged since Eisenhower, is to ensure that American nuclear deterrent remains credible. The president can order retaliation quickly enough to convince adversaries that attack would bring catastrophic response. Whether the briefcase contains the latest satellite phones or the wisdom of previous presidents, its function is the same: to maintain the capability that has kept nuclear peace for 8 decades by ensuring that nuclear war would bring mutual annihilation. The football's classified contents serve dual purpose: operational security that prevents adversaries from exploiting detailed knowledge of American nuclear command procedures, and psychological security that allows citizens to believe the system is more sophisticated than it might actually be. If the American public knew exactly what was in the football, which communication frequencies, which authentication protocols, which specific procedures, that knowledge might be reassuring in demonstrating careful planning. Or it might be alarming in revealing vulnerabilities and simplicities that conflict with public imagination of what nuclear command entails. The classification maintains beneficial ambiguity. The system is sophisticated enough to work reliably, but not so complex that citizens need to worry about arcane details. The president has the capability to command nuclear forces, but the specific mechanisms remain mysterious enough that no one outside the system can identify exactly how they work or where they might fail. This ambiguity also serves deterrence. Adversaries who don't know precise details of how American nuclear command functions must assume it works reliably under all circumstances. The uncertainty prevents them from developing specific attacks against known vulnerabilities. But classification creates its own problems. Without public scrutiny, mistakes might not be corrected. Without congressional oversight of specific procedures, inadequate systems might persist. Without expert review, vulnerabilities might remain unidentified until crisis reveals them. The balance between security through classification and security through transparency remains unresolved. The football's contents stay classified because the Pentagon judges that the risks of disclosure exceed the benefits of public knowledge. Whether that judgment is correct is a question that, by its nature, can't be definitively answered without the disclosure that security concerns prevent. Throughout the Cold War and beyond, there were moments when presidents might have ordered nuclear launch, crises when the football was opened, when authentication codes were checked, when Strategic Air Command went to heightened alert, moments when the system was ready and waiting for presidential order that never came. October 1962, Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy, with the football at his side for 13 days, constantly updated on Soviet forces, repeatedly reviewing attack options. The moment never came when he decided to launch. The crisis resolved through negotiation. January 1968, USS Pueblo seized by North Korea. American intelligence ship captured in international waters. President Johnson briefed on military options, including tactical nuclear strikes against North Korean facilities. The football was ready. Johnson chose diplomatic response instead. April 1975. Fall of Saigon. President Ford monitoring the evacuation, aware that American personnel were under threat, briefed on options for escalation if rescue helicopters were attacked. The football present during the crisis. Ford ordered evacuation only, no military strikes. March 1999. Kosovo War. President Clinton conducting sustained bombing campaign against Serbia, aware that Russian forces were moving in ways that suggested potential confrontation. Options briefed for escalation if Russian intervention occurred. Clinton chose to continue limited operation rather than expand conflict. September 2001. Hours after 9/11 attacks, President Bush airborne on Air Force One, receiving fragmentary reports of potential additional attacks. Strategic forces at high alert. Bush with authentication codes ready. The decision point never crystallized. Additional attacks didn't materialize in ways that made nuclear response relevant. August 2017. North Korean missile tests. President Trump's fire and fury rhetoric. Military options briefed, including limited nuclear strikes against North Korean facilities. The football present during all briefings. Trump chose continued sanctions and diplomatic pressure. In every case, the system was ready. The football was available. The president could have ordered nuclear strike. Authentication would have succeeded. Strategic forces would have executed the orders. And in every case, the president chose not to launch. This pattern of restraint is the most important fact about nuclear weapons in the modern era. They've been available for use by American presidents in multiple crises over 8 decades, and they've been used exactly 0 times since August 1945. The restraint isn't primarily technical. It's not the result of safeguards preventing launch. The restraint is human. Presidents deciding that the circumstances don't justify nuclear use, that alternatives exist, that the consequences of nuclear war exceed any conceivable benefit. The football's history is therefore not primarily a history of near launches prevented by technical failures or procedural safeguards. It's a history of presidents who had the capability to launch and chose not to, who opened the briefcase, reviewed the options, considered the consequences, and decided that maintaining nuclear peace was more important than using nuclear weapons. This restraint occurred despite significant pressures in the other direction. Military advice to strike first during crises. Public pressure for decisive action. Personal anger at provocations or attacks. Political incentives to demonstrate strength through force. The presidents who showed restraint weren't pacifists. Kennedy had confronted the Soviets. Johnson and Nixon had prosecuted war in Vietnam. The first Bush had fought the Gulf War. Clinton had ordered strikes in multiple locations. The second Bush had invaded 2 countries. Trump had threatened military action repeatedly. But none of them used nuclear weapons, despite having ready access to the football and clear constitutional authority to order launch. The question is why? The technical explanation is that nuclear use never met military necessity. Conventional forces proved adequate in every crisis. The strategic explanation is that nuclear use would have escalated conflicts beyond any rational political objective. The moral explanation is that presidents understood the horrific casualties that nuclear weapons would inflict, but perhaps the simplest explanation is that carrying the football makes the abstract reality concrete. Presidents who carry authentication codes, who see the casualty estimates, who understand that their decision would kill millions, experience the weight of nuclear command in ways that make restraint the natural choice. The military aides who carry the football describe this effect in their interactions with presidents. The briefcase makes nuclear weapons real rather than theoretical. Presidents who campaign on nuclear deterrence, who speak publicly about nuclear strength, who use nuclear rhetoric for political purposes, become subdued when they actually hold the authentication codes and realize that the power they've discussed abstractly is now concretely theirs to exercise. Major Thomas Graves, who carried the football for both Obama and Trump, described the pattern. Every president, regardless of their rhetoric or their strategic views, becomes serious in a different way once they have the biscuit in their pocket and they see me standing behind them with the football. The abstractness falls away. They're holding the power to end civilization. And that reality changes how they think about nuclear weapons. Theory becomes weight, rhetoric becomes responsibility, and almost universally, that weight leads toward restraint rather than use. The football's greatest success isn't preventing accidental launch through technical safeguards. It's making presidential nuclear authority real enough that presidents instinctively recoil from using it, except under the most extreme circumstances. Circumstances that thankfully haven't yet occurred in the 8 decades since Hiroshima. Whether that restraint will continue is the question that defines the nuclear age. The football gives presidents the capability. Human judgment provides the restraint. And so far, across multiple presidents with different temperaments, different ideologies, and different crises, that judgment has consistently chosen not to use the power the briefcase contains. Nuclear deterrence is supposed to work through the threat of use. Adversaries refrain from attack because they believe nuclear retaliation would follow. But perhaps deterrence also works through a more subtle mechanism. The weight of nuclear command authority discourages use, even by the people who hold that authority. Presidents who can order nuclear launch become, through that capability, advocates for never launching. The closer one gets to the actual power to destroy civilization, the less attractive that power appears. The football, by making nuclear command concrete and immediate, may paradoxically increase restraint by making presidents acutely aware of what they would be authorizing. This suggests that nuclear peace depends not just on fear of retaliation, but on human reluctance to use weapons that the wielder understands too well. Presidents who carry authentication codes know exactly what those codes would unleash. That knowledge, that weight, that immediate reality of nuclear command creates psychological barrier to use that might be as important as any technical safeguard. The football was designed to give presidents easy access to nuclear launch, but by making that access personal, immediate, and concrete, by requiring presidents to hold authentication codes and face military aides carrying the briefcase, the system may have created psychological obstacle to use that was never explicitly planned, but that has proven more effective than planned safeguards. 2024, 66 years after Eisenhower created the nuclear football, a military aide stands in the hallway outside the Oval Office, a black briefcase handcuffed to their wrist. The scene would be familiar to Major General Chester Clifton in 1963, to Major Thomas Crosby in 1981, to all the military aides who have carried the football through decades of crises and routine days. The briefcase has changed. Better communication equipment, more sophisticated authentication systems, digital documents replacing paper books. But the fundamental duty remains identical. Stay close to the president. Protect the briefcase. Be ready to facilitate nuclear command if needed. The threats have evolved. Cyber attacks, AI spoofing, biological threats, quantum computing challenges. But the fundamental vulnerability remains the same. Human reliability under impossible pressure, system functioning during chaos, and civilization's survival depending on procedures working perfectly when everything else is failing. The presidents have changed. Different personalities, different philosophies, different leadership styles, but the fundamental authority remains constant. Complete presidential power over nuclear weapons with no checks except the president's own judgment about when and whether to use them. The crises have varied: assassinations, terrorist attacks, pandemics, international confrontations. But the fundamental pattern remains. The football is present, ready, available. And presidents, facing the actual weight of nuclear command, choose restraint. What has been learned in 66 years of carrying the apocalypse in a briefcase? That technical sophistication doesn't guarantee security if human factors aren't managed. The most advanced systems in the world struggle with presidents forgetting to carry authentication cards or with military aides being separated from presidents during chaos. That procedures designed for orderly crisis fail when tested by real crisis. Dallas, the Reagan shooting, September 11th. Each revealed that the system's reliability depended on improvisation when situations exceeded planning assumptions. That nuclear command authority is both more powerful and more fragile than theoretical understanding suggests. More powerful because presidents have complete control with no checks. More fragile because that control depends on handcuffs, briefcases, and proximity that can be disrupted by violence or accident. That the weight of nuclear command discourages use. Presidents who hold authentication codes become advocates for never using them. The football makes nuclear weapons concrete enough to inspire restraint rather than abstract enough to permit casual consideration of use. And that luck has been essential to nuclear peace. The system has survived not just through careful planning, but through fortunate timing, through crises not coinciding with system failures, through presidents making correct judgment calls when procedures didn't provide clear answers. The question facing the next 66 years is whether that luck will hold. The football will continue evolving, new technology, revised procedures, adaptation to emerging threats. But the fundamental structure will remain: a president, a briefcase, a military aide, and the weight of knowing that the power to end civilization travels in a small leather case worth less than the authentication card inside it. The military aide carrying the football today faces the same questions that Chester Clifton faced in Dallas. What do I do if violence separates me from the president? How do I maintain custody during chaos? How do I function when procedures don't cover the exact situation I'm facing? And how do I bear the weight of knowing that civilization's survival might depend on my actions during the worst moments in human history? The answers to those questions haven't fundamentally changed. You do your duty. You improvise when procedures fail. You protect the briefcase. And you hope that your training, your judgment, and your luck are sufficient for whatever crisis comes. Most football carriers complete their tours without facing crisis. They stand through routine days, carry the briefcase through uneventful travels, maintain readiness for moments that never come. And they rotate to new assignments, their service notable primarily for nothing having happened. But they know they were ready. And they know that the next person carrying the briefcase might not be as fortunate, might face the crisis that previous generations avoided, might be the person who has to hand the president the football and facilitate the orders that end civilization or preserve it. The briefcase remains, handcuffed to a wrist, waiting, always waiting. 66 years of waiting without being used for its ultimate purpose. 66 years of crises managed, close calls survived, restraint exercised. 66 years of proof that nuclear weapons can be controlled by systems that give presidents complete authority but surround that authority with weight sufficient to inspire restraint. How many more years that pattern will continue is unknowable. Whether the system will survive challenges that exceed those it's already faced is uncertain. Whether future presidents will show the same restraint as previous ones is untestable until tested. The nuclear football exists at the intersection of human frailty and superhuman responsibility. It works because humans make it work, despite all the ways humans can fail. It preserves peace because the weight it represents discourages use, even by those with undisputed authority to use it. And it continues, day after day, crisis after crisis, president after president, carried by military aides who understand that their greatest success is remaining invisible. Their most important contribution is being ready for a moment they hope never comes, and their lasting legacy is simply maintaining continuity of a system that has kept nuclear peace by ensuring that nuclear war would be too terrible to contemplate. The briefcase remains, the weight remains, the responsibility remains, and civilization continues because 66 years of presidents have held the power to end it and chosen not to. May the next 66 years show the same restraint. May the luck that has held so far continue to hold. May the system that depends on human judgment continue to benefit from judgment that chooses peace over apocalypse. The nuclear football sits in a hallway, handcuffed to a wrist, waiting, always waiting. May it wait forever without ever being used for the purpose it was designed to serve. That is the paradox of deterrence. The capability must be real to prevent war, but the capability must never be used, or prevention fails and becomes the catastrophe it was meant to avoid. The briefcase understands this paradox. It exists to facilitate nuclear war while hoping to prevent it. It gives presidents complete power while surrounding that power with weight that inspires restraint. And for 66 years that balance has held. The system has survived, nuclear peace has continued, and the briefcase remains, waiting in hallways, traveling with presidents, present at every crisis, ready for the moment that has not yet come. May it remain waiting. May the moment never come. May human judgment continue choosing restraint when the football is opened and the authentication codes are read and the question is asked, do you order launch? So far, for 66 years across multiple presidents and multiple crises, the answer has been no. May that answer continue. May the weight continue to inspire restraint. May the briefcase continue waiting without ever fulfilling its ultimate purpose. That is the prayer of everyone who has carried the football, who has studied its history, who has understood what it represents. May civilization survive the capability to destroy it. May human judgment continue choosing wisely when given the power to choose catastrophe. The briefcase remains, the weight continues, and so far, against all the odds and all the close calls and all the ways the system could have failed, nuclear peace endures. If you lived through the Cold War, you remember the fear that nuclear weapons created. This story should remind you that the fear was justified. We came far closer to catastrophe than most people understood. But it should also show you that the system, despite all its vulnerabilities, has worked. Imperfectly, barely, sometimes only through luck. But it has worked. If you're too young to remember the Cold War, this story should teach you that nuclear weapons remain the existential threat they've always been. The football still exists. Presidents still carry authentication codes. The capability to end civilization still travels in a briefcase. And that reality demands continued vigilance, careful stewardship, and hope that future presidents will show the same restraint as past ones. Share this history. Remember these stories. Understand that nuclear peace is not guaranteed by technology or treaties alone. It depends on human judgment, human restraint, and human understanding of the weight that comes with the power to destroy everything. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And thank you for understanding that the briefcase handcuffed to a wrist in hallways throughout Washington represents not just American power, but human responsibility for preserving the world we inhabit. The nuclear football remains. May we never need to use it. May the waiting continue, and may civilization survive the weight we carry.